A man named Naga Sadow was about to start a war that would kill hundreds of thousands of people. He had not told anyone yet. He was still planning it. And on the morning this story begins 5,000 years before the Empire, 5,000 years before Vader, 5,000 years before any of the wars you already know, the galaxy had absolutely no idea what was coming. The people who would be caught inside it were just living their lives. That is always how it starts. In the lower district of Sinagar, a fountain was running. It had been running for longer than anyone in the city could remember, not because someone switched it on every morning, because it was fed by a spring so deep underground that the city had been built, knocked down, and rebuilt twice above it without the spring noticing. The water came up cold through old stone and fell into the basin below with a sound like a quiet conversation, not loud enough to hear from the street, only loud enough if you were standing right beside it. The market vendors set up around it every morning. Left tray first, right tray second, sampled pieces in front, the heavy stacks in back. 11 years of the same hands, doing the same arrangement in the same order. Nobody looked at the fountain. It was simply part of the geometry of the place, something you oriented yourself by without thinking, the way you orient yourself by a doorframe you have walked through 10,000 times. That morning was no different from any other morning. That is the thing about the last normal day. It never feels like the last one. 3 districts up from that fountain, in a docking bay that smelled of coolant and old metal, the Starbreaker 12 sat in its berth. It was not a beautiful ship. It had been kept flying well past the point where any reasonable person would have let it rest. Patches over the original hull. A sensor array rebuilt from 3 different manufacturers that had never fully agreed with each other. A nav computer that processed hyperspace data correctly but displayed it in a font that nobody had ever managed to change. Jory Daragon was 23 years old. She was sitting at the nav station when she heard the hatch open. She knew her brother's footsteps well enough to know, before he sat down, that the meeting had not gone the way they hoped. Gav dropped into the co-pilot's seat. He rubbed his face with both hands, a habit she had watched him develop at 10 years old. When their parents did not come back from a run into the outer rim, and the world suddenly required a different kind of processing than 10-year-olds are built for. 60 days, he said. She had been hoping for 90. She didn't say so. 60 days, she repeated. Then he takes the ship. He was kind about it, he said he remembered. I know. She did know. Araba was a decent man. He had extended their credit further than a decent man probably should have. He had known their parents, had watched Jory and Gav grow up in the berths of ships like this one, while their mother and father pushed routes through the outer rim that nobody else wanted to fly. He did not want the 12. He wanted the debt cleared. Those were different things. Both were equally impossible right now. Jory looked down at the datapad in her lap. She had been building this route for 3 weeks, pulling data from old survey archives, cross-referencing records from explorers who had pushed past the last mapped Republic coordinates before turning back. The route on the screen ended past the final official marker, past the point where the old charts simply stopped, and the notation beyond them read, in the formal language of Republic cartography, surveyed to this point. Beyond, unknown. There's something out here, she said. She tilted the pad toward him. Gav studied the display. He was quiet for a moment. She knew he was running the same numbers she had already run. The risk against the debt against the ship against everything, because without the 12, they were not explorers. They were 2 people in a port city with no skills that translated to ground and no particular desire to find out if that was true. It's past the last coordinate. he said. Yes. Into space, nobody's mapped. That's what exploration is. He almost smiled. Not quite. Mom used to say that. She did. A silence between them, not uncomfortable. The kind that builds between two people who have spent most of their lives in the same small spaces, who have learned that silence does not always need to be filled. Their mother had said it. Their father had always answered the second half. And that's why explorers die young. He said it as a joke. He had then gone out on a run into uncharted space and not come back. They did not discuss this. They had discussed it. They would discuss it again. But not tonight. 3 days, Jory said. We leave in 3 days. 48,000 light years away, the sun came up red over Zeost. It was always red. Old in the way that only certain suns are old, not dying, just heavy. The light it produced had a weight to it. When it came through the stone windows of the archive building in the early morning, it did not look like dawn. It looked like the end of something, the color of a fire that has been burning since before you were born. Dreveth had spent his entire childhood thinking this was what morning looked like everywhere. He was 12 before he learned that most suns were yellow. The information had unsettled him in a way he had never been able to fully explain, not because yellow was wrong, but because it meant that the Zeost morning was specific, was his. That the red-lit, heavy-shadowed quality of this particular dawn, and the way it made the old archive stones look warm even in winter, did not exist anywhere else in exactly this form. He arrived at the archive an hour before his shift. He always arrived early, not from ambition. The early morning archive was a different place than the mid-shift archive, quieter in a way that had texture to it. Old stone, preserved records. The smell of the cataloging fluid used on the oldest tablets, which smelled like cold iron, and something underneath that nobody had ever named precisely. He collected his meal from the commissary. Pressed grain, something hot, in a metal cup that was technically called tea. A piece of preserved fruit so thoroughly preserved it had become its own category of food, related to fruit the way a copy is related to an original. He ate it in the same order every morning. Grain first, tea while it was still worth drinking quickly, fruit at the end. He carried his tray to his station. The archive corridors were long and slightly curved, built in an older style, before straight angles became standard, before the architectural logic shifted toward efficiency and away from the suggestion of enclosure. The walls held the morning red in layers. Some of the stones in these corridors were 4,000 years old. They had been here before Dreveth's parents were born, before their parents, before anyone currently living had a name. He set down his tray. Sevrath was already at his desk. The older man was always already at his desk. Dreveth had never once arrived to find Sevrath's chair empty. He had once asked the Archivist what time he arrived. Sevrath had looked at him with the specific expression of a man who stopped counting time in units a long time ago and found the question mildly amusing. "Before you," he said. That was the entire answer. Sevrath was in his 70s. He had worked in this archive for 50 years. He had the hands of someone who had spent decades handling fragile things, careful, precise, always slightly held back from full contact, as if everything he touched was something he was borrowing. He pushed a file across the desk without looking up. "Fleet reports," he said. "Current cycle. Cross-reference with the supply manifest from the 3rd quarter. Note anything that doesn't match." Dreveth took the file. He sat down. He opened it. The fleet reports were standard format: departure times, destination coordinates, crew complements. Supply allocations. He had processed hundreds of them. He began the cross-reference the way he always did, methodically, column by column. He was 20 minutes in when he noticed the first inconsistency. The supply allocations were wrong, not wrong in the way of clerical error, wrong in volume. 3 separate fleet movements in the last 2 months had drawn supplies at a rate consistent with extended deployment, not routine exercises. Extended deployment meant extended absence. Extended absence meant destination coordinates that required more travel time than the official destination entries indicated. He made a note. He moved to the next file. The second inconsistency was in the crew complements. Specialist classes, navigators, siege coordinators, long-range weapons technicians were represented at proportions that made no sense for patrol activity. Those were invasion weight complements. The ratio was unmistakable if you knew what to look for. He had read enough history to know what to look for. He made another note, filed it in the cross-reference log, moved to the next file. He did not look up at Sevrath. Sevrath did not look up at him. The archive was very quiet. Midway through the shift, Dreveth reached a casualty record filed at the back of the current cycle package. It had been included without explanation, a retroactive entry, updating older records with newly confirmed information. The date on it was from 12 years ago. He recognized the event before he read the details. The buffer zone ambush. A supply convoy operating in the no-man's space between Republic-adjacent territory and the Sith Empire's outer edges, the region that neither civilization had formally claimed, that pirates had operated in for centuries because neither side's enforcement reached there comfortably. 14 crew, a small vessel, commercial class, ambushed by forces that were never conclusively identified. He had read this record before, many times. He had processed it 3 separate times during his years in the archive. Each time it was updated with new administrative notes. He had processed it with the specific, careful neutrality that archive work required, acknowledging the information, recording it accurately, moving on. He read it again now. His parents had been on that convoy. His father had coordinated supply routing in the buffer zone for 11 years. His mother had gone on that particular run because the regular co-coordinator was ill, and the ship needed someone who knew the route. He had been 19 when the confirmation came, 19 and working his first year in the archive, and Sevrath had found him standing in this corridor with the initial report in his hands, reading it the way you read something that cannot mean what it means. And Sevrath had said nothing, had simply stood beside him until Dreveth set the report down and went back to his desk. He set the file down now. He stood up. He walked to the window at the end of the corridor, the long window that faced the city, that looked out over the archive district toward the upper quarters where the Dark Council buildings rose above everything else, where the spires of the old order caught the last of the red morning light before it became the red afternoon light. The sky above Ziost was deep purple. It was always deep purple before midday, the red sun not yet high enough to push the darkness fully out of the upper atmosphere. Stars were still visible at the zenith, faint, present, the way things are present when they refuse to be erased by light. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about the buffer zone, the space between things, the part of the galaxy that did not belong to either side and therefore belonged to nothing, to pirates and to debris and to the specific silence of unclaimed distance. His parents had gone into that space and had not come back. He thought about that. He did not usually think about that. He stood at the window until the thought had moved through him and settled somewhere below conscious processing. The way the archive trained you to let things settle accurate. recorded, filed, but not examined beyond what the record required. Then he went back to his desk. He picked up the fleet report. He finished the cross-reference. At the end of his shift, Sevrath stopped beside his desk. "You filed the anomaly notes," the older man said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Good." Sevrath gathered his own materials. He moved slowly, not infirmity, just the pace of someone who had stopped being in a hurry several decades ago and found the slower pace more accurate. "Read the records from the third expansion campaign when you have time. The ones in the lower archive, not the summary files, the detail-level accounts." Drevith looked up. "Why?" Sevrath considered the question. "The supply allocation patterns are similar," he said, and then he walked away. Drevith sat for a moment after he left. The third expansion campaign. He knew it. Every Archivist knew it. It was the last time a Sith Dark Lord had attempted to push beyond the Empire's established borders into contested space. It had lasted 14 months. The Dark Lord who had ordered it was not, afterward, remembered favorably. He filed the thought, did not examine it further, put on his outer coat, and walked to the corridor window one more time before leaving. Outside, in the deep purple late afternoon, 3 Sith fleet vessels were moving in formation toward the upper orbital lanes. He watched them. Not 3 vessels, 5. A 6th emerging from behind the upper district structures, joining the formation at the edge of his sightline. 6 was not a patrol number. 6, at that formation spacing, with those hull classes he had cross-referenced enough fleet reports to know what 6 at that spacing meant. It meant assembly. It meant something larger that these 6 were a part of. Something that was not yet fully visible from the archive window, because most of it had not yet moved into formation. He watched until they were gone from his sightline. Then he walked home. He did not sleep well. That night, in a docking bay in Sinagar, Jory Daragon sat alone on the Starbreaker 12. Gav had gone to settle a secondary invoice with a fuel supplier. She had the nav station to herself, and the data pad in her lap, and the route on the screen, the route that ended past the final Republic coordinate, past the point where the charts became the notation that meant we stopped here. Her parents had stopped somewhere near there, too. Not exactly there. Their last confirmed position had been a survey run in the deep outer rim, some distance short of the border regions. They had filed a departure report. They had not filed a return. The Republic Survey Office had noted the absence and reclassified them as lost. The record still existed in the public archive. She assumed she had not checked in several years because checking did not change what the record said. She looked at the route. The last mapped coordinate was a point in space that looked like every other point in space, distinguished only by the fact that the people who had charted the galaxy had reached it and decided that whatever came next was not their responsibility. Her parents had been the kind of people who did not find that convincing. She was, apparently, also that kind of person. She saved the route to the nav computer's primary memory. She set the departure calculation for 3 days out. She turned off the station light and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds the ship made, the cooling metal, the low hum of the standby systems, the specific small vibration the port engine mount had developed that they kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing. She knew this ship the way you know, a place you have lived in long enough that its sounds are indistinguishable from your own heartbeat. She did not know, sitting there in the dark, that she was going to lose it. Not the ship to the debt, though that threat was real. Something larger. Something that was already in motion 48,000 light-years away. In a civilization she did not know existed. in the mind of a man she had not yet met. Outside, in the lower district 3 streets away, the fountain ran through the night. The market was empty. The grain vendors' trays were stacked and covered. The plaza was quiet in the way that cities are quiet, only between the last night walker and the first morning one. A genuine gap, a pause, a moment where the city is neither inhabited nor abandoned, but simply present with itself. The water moved through the old stone, cold, continuous, fed by something so deep underground that nothing happening at the surface had ever reached it. The city had no reason to expect anything unusual tomorrow. It would not expect it the morning after that, either. By the morning after that, it would be too late for expectations. The last thing the nav computer said before everything changed was, "Coordinate limit reached, proceeding into unsurveyed space." Jory had approved the prompt. She had approved it because that was the point. The route she had built was designed to go past the limit, past the edge of what the Republic had charted, into the space that the old surveys marked as not their business. She had approved the prompt the same way she had approved 100 similar prompts on 100 similar runs. Routine acknowledgement of a technical boundary. The ship crossed it, and then the hyperspace tunnel collapsed. Not catastrophically, not an emergency drop. A clean exit, the kind the nav computer executed when it detected mass shadow interference ahead, when something in the space beyond the jump coordinate was large enough to require a course correction before proceeding. The stars stretched back into points. The viewport filled with normal space. Jory looked at it. Gav looked at it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The space outside was not empty. There were structures, not ruins, not debris. Active, powered, inhabited structures, orbital installations of a size and complexity that did not belong to anything the Republic had built in this region. Lights along docking arms, the thermal signature of active engines, ships, multiple ships, at distances that suggested they had been stationed here, not passing through. Jory's hands were already on the instruments. Fuel adequate, hull integrity nominal, sensor array functioning, all 3 manufacturers' components momentarily in agreement, as if the gravity of the situation had resolved their disagreements. Position data, the nav computer was working, but the coordinates it was generating were outside every reference grid the ship carried. They were in space that her charts did not contain. "We should," Gav started. "I know," she said. She was already calculating the return jump. It would take 4 minutes to spool the hyperdrive. She needed the approach vector to clear the mass shadow of whatever those installations were sitting on. She needed the sensors to stop trying to identify what they were looking at and start giving her clean navigational data. She got 2 minutes into the calculation. Then the communication system activated. Not a hail, not a request for identification. A lock, a tight beam transmission on a frequency her system had never encountered, from a source close enough that the signal strength made the speaker distort. The language that came through it was not basic, not any trade language she knew. It was something older, structured differently, built on a phonology that her ear could not immediately parse into meaning. It did not sound like a greeting. Gav said, "That's not—" "No," she said. "It's not." 3 ships had detached from the nearest installation and were moving toward them. They were not moving fast. They were not moving with the urgency of an emergency intercept. They were moving with the specific, deliberate pace of something that is not worried about the outcome. Something that knows, with complete certainty, that whatever it is approaching is not going to get away. Jory finished the calculation anyway. The hyperdrive did not spool. Something was interfering with it, not a mechanical failure, not a power issue, something external, something that had reached into the ship's systems through a mechanism she had no instrument to detect or explain. She looked at the three ships getting larger in the viewport. She looked at Gav. He looked back at her with the expression she knew, the one from childhood, the one from the years after their parents didn't come back, the one that meant, I don't know what to do, and I need you to know what to do. She did not know what to do. She put her hands in her lap. She waited. The holding facility was built from dark stone, not prefab panels, not processed composite, actual cut stone, fitted without visible seam, polished to a surface that reflected light without warmth. The corridor they walked her through after boarding was wide enough for 4 people across and tall enough that the ceiling was lost in shadow. It smelled of something mineral and something older underneath that, something biological that she could not name and did not want to examine too closely. She catalogued everything. This was how her mind worked under pressure, the same way it worked with nav data, with survey coordinates, with the fragments of old exploration records she combed for route information. Systematic, specific. She catalogued the dimensions of the corridor, the spacing of the wall fixtures, the number of guards in her peripheral vision, the sound her boots made on the stone floor versus the sound the guards' footwear made. The guards were taller than average. Not uniformly, there was variation in height, in build, in the specific way each one held itself. But there was something in the quality of the way they moved that was not quite the same as human. Not wrong, exactly. Just assembled by a slightly different process. They put her in a room with Gav. The room had 2 walls of solid stone and 2 walls of something transparent, not glass, something that held its shape differently, something she suspected was stronger than it looked. Outside the transparent walls, a view of the interior of the installation. Levels, multiple levels, visible from her position, populated with movement people, vehicles, operations she could not interpret at this distance. Not a border outpost, not a small patrol installation set up at the edge of claimed space. This was the edge of something large, something that had been here for a very long time, operating on its own logic, entirely unaware that the Republic considered this space unmapped. The Republic had not mapped it because the Republic had not been here. Whatever this civilization was, they had been here without the Republic's awareness, for she could not estimate. Long enough for these buildings, long enough for this organization, long enough for a communication frequency she had never encountered in 23 years of working navigation routes across Republic space. "What do we do?" Gav said quietly. She looked through the transparent wall at the levels of activity below. "We watch," she said. "We learn what we can. We wait for an opening. And if there isn't one?" She didn't answer. She already knew she would not be able to calculate her way out of this one. Not with instruments, not with route data. This was past the last coordinate on every chart she owned. 3 levels above the holding room, in a chamber that had been used for Dark Council deliberations for 2,000 years, Naga Sadow and Ludo Kressh were deciding whether Jory and Gav Daragon would live or die. They were not the only voices in the room. The full Dark Council was assembled, the senior Sith Lords of the Empire, each carrying the weight of traditions and power structures that predated any individual in the room by centuries. They sat in their designated positions. They spoke in the order protocol demanded. But the argument was between Sadow and Kressh, and everyone present understood this, and the rest of the deliberation was scaffolding around that central fact. Kressh spoke first. He was an older man, not old in the way of decline, but old in the way of accumulation. Decades of political survival in a culture that killed the politically weak. He had the specific stillness of someone who has been in enough rooms like this one to know that stillness is a form of power. His argument was simple, and he made it simply. The humans were Republic scouts. There was no other explanation. The Republic had located the Empire. They had sent agents in cover, two young people, in a small, unremarkable vessel, the ideal profile for plausible deniability. Executing them would send a message. Closing the borders and building defensive positions would prepare the Empire for what came next. The Republic would eventually attack. The question was whether the Empire met that attack from a prepared position or an unprepared one. He was not wrong about the threat. He was wrong about what Jory and Gav actually were, but he was not wrong about the threat. Naga Sadow waited until Kressh finished. He was younger than Kressh, not young, but younger. He moved differently. Where Kressh was still, Sadow was precise, the kind of precision that came from an intelligence that was always slightly ahead of the conversation it was in, always working on the response before the current sentence was finished. He had the attention of the room before he spoke. He had learned how to have attention. It was a skill, like all useful skills in the Sith Empire, that he had developed deliberately. He said, "Kressh wants us to hide." Not quite what Kressh had said. Close enough to be recognizable, far enough to be an insult that Kressh could not directly dispute without accepting the framing. He continued, "The Republic had been the dominant power at the time of the exile. That was true. 4,000 years ago, the Dark Jedi who had been cast out had crossed into this space and built an empire from nothing, built it in the shadow of a Republic that could have crushed them if it had bothered to look. The Republic had not looked. It had not looked for 4,000 years. In those 4,000 years, the Empire had grown, had developed, had built the capacity to do what the exile had not been able to do. The Republic was not the same Republic that had expelled their ancestors. It had not been tested in centuries. Its Jedi were scholars and peacekeepers, not warriors. Two young explorers in a borrowed ship did not come from an empire preparing for war. They came from a civilization that no longer knew the Sith Empire existed. That was not a threat. That was an opening. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. Kressh said, "You are talking about invasion." Sadow said, "I am talking about reclaiming what was taken." These were the same thing. Both men knew it. The distinction mattered politically, not practically. The deliberation continued for 3 hours. In the lower archive of the installation, where the deliberation was taking place, Dreveth was processing records. Not the records of the deliberation, those were sealed, accessible only to designated council scribes whose clearance level was above his. He was processing the standard administrative backlog, supply manifests, fleet maintenance logs, personnel transfers. The work of running a civilization, the part that continued regardless of what was being decided 3 levels above. He heard the voices twice. The first time was a fragment raised volume from a corridor above him, the sound traveling down through the stone imperfectly, the words indistinguishable, something emphatic. He noted it and continued working. The second time was clearer. A door had opened somewhere above. 2 people in the corridor, lower voices now, post-deliberation voices, the specific tone of people who have just been in a formal setting and have stepped outside it. He caught 3 phrases. The Republic humans. Then Sadow will not be stopped. Then what he does not understand about the cost. The door closed. The voices were gone. He sat with the supply manifest in front of him. The Republic humans. He had heard this phrase twice in the last week, in separate contexts, from separate sources. He had filed it the way he filed anomalies, noted, cross-referenced, waiting for the pattern to become visible. He did not have enough to see the pattern yet. He had fragments. A supply allocation that didn't fit routine exercises. Fleet vessel counts that suggested assembly. And now, whatever was being decided 3 levels above him, which had generated enough heat to raise voices in a room built to contain deliberation. He went back to the supply manifest. He was an archivist. His job was to record what he was given to record. He was not given the full record. He transcribed what he had, filed it accurately, noted the gaps as gaps, and left them. Naga Sadow went to the holding level alone. He had dismissed his attendants. That in itself was unusual. Unusual enough that the guards he passed noted it and said nothing. Because noting unusual things about Naga Sadow and saying nothing was a survival skill that the standing guard had collectively developed over the years of his rise to power. He stood outside the transparent wall. He looked at the 2 young humans inside. The woman was awake, sitting against the far wall with her knees up, watching the levels outside with the specific cataloging attention of someone who was afraid but was managing the fear through information gathering. He recognized that. It was a Sith quality. In its way, the instinct to assess a dangerous situation rather than simply react to it. He noted it. The man was asleep, or pretending to be. Sadow stood there for a long time. He had been building toward this moment for most of his adult life. Not this specific moment, not 2 young explorers from a ship called the Starbreaker 12. He had been building toward the moment when a justification for what he had always intended to do would present itself in a form that could not be argued away. He had intended to move against the Republic. He had believed this was the correct action for the Sith Empire for 20 years. He had lacked the Council's support to move without cause. Now a cause had arrived in a borrowed ship with mismatched sensor components and a nav computer that had pushed 1 coordinate past the last safe marker. He was not going to waste it. The plan was already formed. He would free the woman. He would make her believe he was doing it from something close to mercy. And he was, in a partial way. He was not a man who needed to manufacture cruelty. He would send her home. He would place a beacon on her ship that she would not detect, set to a frequency that his fleet could follow through hyperspace. She would lead them to the Republic's heart. She would never know she had done it. He would go to war, and the Council would follow because they had been maneuvered into a position where they would have to, and the Republic would be unprepared because it did not know the Sith Empire existed as a military force. And the war would accomplish in months what 4,000 years of waiting had not accomplished. He took the beacon from the inner pocket of his coat. It was small, the size of his thumb, no moving parts, no power signature detectable by standard Republic instruments. He had developed it himself, or rather, he had directed its development, which was the same thing when you were the one who had conceived of the need for it, and specified the requirements, and reviewed the work until it was correct. It weighed almost nothing. He turned it over in his hand once. The woman on the other side of the transparent wall had not seen him. She was watching the activity on the lower levels, still cataloging, still processing, still doing the thing she did under pressure. which was to keep looking until she found something that made sense. She would not find it tonight. Tomorrow he would have her brought to him. He would speak to her carefully. He would be the thing she needed him to be. And in a few days, she would be in hyperspace, going home, and the beacon would be transmitting, and the first fleet would be moving before she landed. He put the beacon back in his pocket. He walked back to his chambers. In the lower district of Sinagar, the fountain ran through the night. The war had not begun, but the decision had just been made, in a room lit by the red light of Zeost, by a man who had been waiting for a justification his entire life. The justification had arrived. He had not hesitated for a single moment. The first thing Jory noticed about separation was the silence. Not the silence of the holding room that had its own texture, stone and recycled air, and the distant mechanical hum of a civilization operating around her. Not external silence, internal. The specific quiet that arrives when the person you have spent your entire life navigating beside is no longer in the room. She had not known it would feel like that. She had not known, before this, that another person could be so built into your sense of direction that their absence registered as a navigational problem. They had been separated on the second day. No explanation. 2 guards, a gesture, and Gav was gone through a different door. She had watched him go. He had looked back once, the same expression from the ship, the one that asked her to know what to do. She had not known what to do. She had held his gaze until the door closed, and then she had turned back to the transparent wall and resumed cataloging. She cataloged. She thought about Gav. The argument had happened 3 months before the run. Not a large argument. Not the kind that restructures a relationship. The kind that 2 people who know each other very well have when they are tired and the debt is pressing and a decision needs to be made before either of them is ready to make it well. Arba had suggested a route. It was a reasonable suggestion. A mapped commercial corridor in the mid-rim, modest return, low risk, the kind of run that would chip at the debt without solving it, the kind they had been running for 2 years while Jory built toward something better in the navigation archives. Arba had sent the details with a note that said, "This one is reliable. This one, I know." Gav had wanted to take it. Jory had wanted to keep building the longer route. They had sat in the 12 small common space, 2 chairs and a table bolted to the floor, and a food heater that worked intermittently, and they had gone back and forth about it, the way they went back and forth about most things, not with anger, but with the specific friction of 2 people who see the same problem clearly and arrive at different conclusions. The archive route is speculation, Gav said. We don't know what's out there. That's why it pays better than the mapped routes. It pays better if there's something to find. If there isn't, there is something. The survey data is incomplete, not absent. There's mass density readings from 2 separate expeditions that suggest Jory. He said her name the way he sometimes said her name, which was not as an interruption, but as a request for her to come back from the data and be present in the room with him. What if you're wrong? She looked at him. He was not asking if she was wrong about the route. He was asking the larger question, the one under the root question, the one they rarely asked out loud, because asking it out loud required acknowledging that the thing they were doing was more fragile than they preferred to admit. Their parents had been right about routes, consistently, spectacularly right. Their father had found 3 corridors in the outer rim that became major commercial lanes after his initial surveys. Their mother had navigated by something that was partly calculation and partly instinct, and partly something she described as reading the space. the ability to interpret mass density patterns and gravitational echoes in a way that the nav computer supported but did not lead. They had been very good at this. And they had been gone since Jory was 12 and Gav was 10, which meant that the thing they had been very good at had not, in the end, protected them. "I'm not wrong," Jory said. Gav looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, just that. No further argument." He picked up the root data she had compiled and studied it for 20 minutes, asking specific questions about the survey records she had used and the gaps she had filled by inference. He asked good questions. He always asked good questions. That was one of the things about Gav, the thing that made his trust in her judgment more meaningful than simple deference. He was not trusting her blindly. He was examining the work and then trusting the person who had done it. "We'll take Arba's route first," he said finally. "Clear some of the balance, then we run yours." She had agreed. They had taken the commercial route. It had performed as Arba promised, reliable, modest, unmemorable. They had cleared a portion of the debt. Then they had prepared the longer run. She had been right about there being something past the last coordinate. She had not been right about what it was. On the 14th day of captivity, they brought her to Naga Sadow, not to an interrogation room, not to a formal council chamber, to what she would later understand was his private study, a room that held the accumulated objects of a specific kind of intelligence. Old star charts on the walls, real ones, not displayed on screens but printed or carved into material that held them permanently. Models of fleet formations on a central table, a viewport facing the installation's exterior, showing the dark and the distant stars and the ships moving in the middle distance. He was standing at the viewport when she entered. He turned. He said, in basic that was accented but fluent in a way that indicated study, not native acquisition. "You navigated past the Republic's last coordinate deliberately." Not a question, a statement made to see how she would respond to it. "Our nav computer crossed the limit," she said. "We had a course irregularity." He looked at her with the specific attention of someone who was not going to argue with what she had said, but also was not going to pretend to have believed it. "Your nav computer," he said, "crossed a limit that your nav computer was programmed to acknowledge as a boundary. That requires an override. Someone on your ship authorized the override." He paused. "The authorization code in your system is registered to your personal access." She said nothing. He did not press it. He moved to the table with the fleet models and stood beside it, looking at the formation arrangement, and for a moment seemed entirely occupied by something she was not part of. Then he said, "Your parents were explorers." She kept her expression still. "The Daragon name is in several navigational survey records that our historians have acquired over the years. Outer Rim corridors, some of them near this region." He looked up at her. "Your family has been moving toward this space for a generation." She did not know how to respond to this, because it was true and she had not thought of it in those terms, and something about the way he had stated it made the back of her throat tighten. He was not cruel about it. That was the problem. He was careful, attentive in the way of someone who has decided to be attentive, who has chosen to understand the person in front of them rather than simply process them. He asked about the routes she had been running. He asked about the nav archive work. He asked specific questions that demonstrated he had read the details of her personal logs. She noted this, filed it, did not react to it, and that he had understood what he read well enough to ask questions that were not generic. She answered some of them. She watched herself answer them and noted, with the part of her mind that was always watching, that she was answering more than she had intended to answer. Not secrets, Not anything that felt dangerous in the moment, but more than zero, more than she would have answered if he had been what she had expected him to be. She was 23 years old. She had been in captivity for 2 weeks. Her brother was in a different part of the installation, and she did not know what was happening to him. Someone was being kind to her. She was exhausted and afraid, and the kindness reached something in her that the exhaustion and fear had left exposed. She accepted it with the part of herself that needed it, and she monitored it with the part of herself that was her parents' daughter, and knew that in unmapped space, nothing that seemed like safe harbor was automatically safe. Both parts of her were telling the truth. That was the difficulty. What was happening to Gav was different. She would not know this fully until later. During captivity, she had fragments the quality of his expression, the one time they allowed him to visit her, the careful way he chose his words, the new precision in how he talked about the Sith that suggested he had been given information and was still deciding what to do with it. He had been taken somewhere she had not been taken. He had been shown things she had not been shown. Specifically, the history. The actual history, not the official Sith version, or not only that, but the original records, the account of the exile. The Dark Jedi who had been expelled from the Republic 4,000 years ago, not for power, as the simplified version suggested, but for a philosophical disagreement about the nature of the Force that the Jedi Council had resolved by expulsion rather than debate. The exiles had come to this space, had found the Sith species, had built an empire from what they found and what they brought with them. Gav was not a scholar, but he was not incurious. He read what they gave him to read. He asked questions, the way he always asked questions, specific, genuine, not performing skepticism, but also not abandoning it. He was shown the records of the first contact between the exiled Jedi and the Sith species. He was shown the population records of the Sith Empire as it currently stood, a civilization of real size, real depth, real history, operating in a region of space the Republic had simply never bothered to map. He began to believe that the Sith had a legitimate grievance. He was not wrong about this. The exile had been real. The history had been real. 4,000 years of building a civilization in the space the Republic had discarded, that was real too. A people who had been told, implicitly, by the Republic's complete indifference to their existence, that what they had built did not matter, and what they were did not matter, that had weight. Gav felt the weight of it. He was wrong about how much weight it should carry. He was wrong about which conclusion to draw from it. But the wrongness grew from something that was genuinely true, and Jory, when she understood, later, what had happened to him in those weeks, could never make herself say he had simply been fooled. He had been shown real things. He had drawn the wrong conclusions from them. These were different failures, and they required different responses, and she was never sure afterward whether she had found the right response or simply the one she could live with. On the 22nd day, Naga Sadow told her she could go. He told her this in the same study, at the same table. He explained that the Sith Empire had no interest in holding Republic citizens against their will, that her presence had been a misunderstanding, that her ship was prepared for departure, that Gav would follow once certain administrative matters were resolved. He did not specify what administrative matters, and something in her knew not to press the question because the answer might close a door she needed to leave open. She asked about Gav directly anyway. He said, "Your brother is safe. He will follow you." She looked at him. He held her gaze. She could not tell if he was lying. She was not sure, even then, that lying was the right word for what Naga Sadow did. He operated in a space where true things and useful things overlapped imperfectly, and he navigated that space with the same precision he brought to everything. Gav was safe. That was probably true. He would follow she did not know. She made a decision. She would go. She would bring help. She would come back. She believed this. It was not a lie, she told herself. She intended it. Completely. In the moment she decided it. The road between intention and outcome was a distance she could not yet see. The Starbreaker 12 was where they had docked it. Cleaned, she noticed. Restocked with fuel and basic provisions. The nav computer was running. Someone had powered it up before her arrival, and the display was showing a preloaded jump coordinate, which she studied for a long moment before deciding it was genuine. A route back through the unmapped space toward the Republic border, toward the last coordinate her charts recognized. She sat at the nav station. She looked at the preloaded coordinate. She thought about Gav. She thought about the archive study and Naga Sadow's careful questions and the way she had answered more than she intended. She thought about what Gav had looked like the last time she saw him, the careful new precision in his words, the way he was holding something she couldn't name yet. She thought about their parents. She thought about the route she had built from the survey archive, the route that had brought them here, the route that had felt right in the way things feel right before they are tested. She would come back. She would bring people who knew what to do about this Jedi, or Republic military, or someone with more tools than two explorers in a ship that was held together with mismatched components and her own stubbornness. She would come back and she would bring Gav home. She entered the coordinate. She initiated the jump sequence. The hyperdrive spooled cleanly. No interference. Whatever had been blocking it before no longer present. The stars outside the viewport stretched into lines, then collapsed into the tunnel. Then the tunnel took her. She was in hyperspace. She was going home. She did not know about the beacon. It was in the lower hull, behind a panel that covered a secondary power coupling, fixed to the bulkhead with adhesive rated for long-term installation, the size of a thumb. No moving parts. No power signature her instruments could detect, transmitting on a frequency she had never encountered and would not know to look for. It had been transmitting since before she boarded. It would transmit until the war it was built to start had run its course. The title is not fair to him. That should be said before anything else. Drevith of Ziost did not choose a side the way a person chooses a route or a profession or a meal. He was born inside a side. He grew up inside it. He learned to read inside it. The civilization that shaped every assumption he carried about order, about history, about what a person owed. The place that made them was the Sith Empire, and the Sith Empire was going to war. And he was part of the Sith Empire. The title is not fair. It is accurate. Those are different things, and the difference between them is most of what this chapter is about. Sevrath had been in the archive for 51 years when Drevith arrived as a junior cataloger at 19. He did not make a particular impression on Drevith at first. He was simply the senior archivist present, precise, economical with both words and movement, the kind of person whose authority was so completely established that it required no performance. He did not instruct Drevith formally. He assigned work, observed the results, and occasionally redirected without explaining why the redirection was necessary. The explanation, Drevith eventually understood, was always in the work itself. Sevrath taught by designing tasks that contained their own lessons. Their first real conversation happened 6 months into Drevith's assignment. He had made an error in a cross-reference, a small one. a date transposition that changed the meaning of a fleet record from routine patrol to a falsified entry. The error was correctable. The implications of it, once corrected, were more significant than the original record had appeared. He brought it to Sevrath, expecting the kind of acknowledgement that came with catching something important. Sevrath looked at it. He said, "How long did it take you to find this?" 3 hours. How long would it have taken someone who wasn't looking for errors? Dreveth considered this. They wouldn't have found it. It's in a supporting file. Nobody reads the supporting files unless they're cross-referencing. No, Sevrath said. They wouldn't have found it. He handed the corrected record back. File it. Note the discrepancy in the amendment log. Do not discuss it with anyone outside this room. Dreveth filed it. He noted it. He did not discuss it. He did not ask why. He understood why. The archive's value was in its accuracy, but its survival was in its discretion. Records that made powerful people uncomfortable had a way of becoming incomplete if the people who held them were not careful about who knew what they held. He had read enough history to understand this. He had been in the archive long enough to understand that the history he had read was partly made of the things that previous archivists had protected. He did not discuss the corrected record outside the room. Sevrath did not thank him. That was the beginning of what they were to each other. 3 weeks before the invasion fleet launched, Sevrath left a file on Dreveth's desk. No note, just the file, a physical one. Old format, the kind used for records that predated the current cataloging system. The label on the outside read, "Third Expansion Campaign Detail Records, Unabridged." Dreveth recognized the reference. He had been thinking about it since the night he had watched the formation ships move overhead, and Sevrath had said, without quite saying, that the supply allocations looked familiar. He opened it. He read it over 3 days, in the early morning hours before his shift, at the same desk where he had processed 100 supply manifests without looking up. The third expansion campaign had lasted 14 months. It had been ordered by a Dark Lord whose name was in the official records as a cautionary entry, a lord who had overestimated the Empire's reach and underestimated the cost of supply lines stretched across unknown space. The campaign had achieved its initial objectives. The Dark Lord had expanded into contested territory, had established forward positions, had projected power into a region the Empire had not previously controlled. Then the supply lines failed, not from enemy action, from distance, from the simple arithmetic of keeping a military force operational in space that was too far from everything it needed. The forward positions could not be resupplied quickly enough. The troops that had taken those positions found themselves holding ground they could not feed or fuel or reinforce. The retreat had been worse than not advancing would have been. The regions the Empire had temporarily controlled were abandoned. The populations that had cooperated with the occupation were left without the protection they had been promised. The cost in material and personnel was documented in the detail records with the specific, honest accounting that archive work required. The Dark Lord had not survived the political aftermath. Dreveth read the detail records and then sat with them for a while. Then he went to find Sevrath. The older man was in the lower archive, the cold storage room where the oldest tablets were kept, doing the twice-annual condition assessment. He looked up when Dreveth came in. He waited. "The supply allocation models in the current fleet reports," Dreveth said. "They're the same class of error." Sevrath looked back at the tablet he was examining. "The initial phase is well supplied," Dreveth continued. "The forward deployment projections assume resupply routes that don't exist yet. If the campaign extends past the initial strike, file your analysis in the standard amendment log," Sevrath said. "Note the discrepancy." Do not discuss it outside this room. Dreveth stood there for a moment. Did someone read the third expansion records before this campaign was planned? He asked. Sevrath set down the tablet he was holding. He said, someone approved the current supply allocations. Someone with access to the full planning documents. Someone who had the authority to review historical precedents before the planning was finalized. He picked up the next tablet. File your analysis, he said. Note the discrepancy. He did not say anything else. Dreveth went back to his desk. He filed the analysis. He noted the discrepancy. He did not discuss it outside the room. The campaign launched on the schedule that had been set before any discrepancy was noted. The night before deployment, Dreveth worked late. He was not required to. His orders were standard report to the transport assignment at first light, carry personal kit not exceeding the weight limit, present identification at the boarding checkpoint. Nothing in those orders required him to spend the last evening in the archive. He spent it there anyway. He was copying records. Specific ones, the detail-level accounts from the third expansion campaign, and 2 similar campaigns before it, and several administrative records that he judged likely to be relevant if he ever had the opportunity to write a comprehensive account of the current campaign's planning failures. He copied them to a portable storage format. He did not ask permission to do this. He did not log the copies in the outgoing materials register. These were, technically, violations of archive protocol. He did them carefully and completely. He was almost finished when Sevrath appeared in the doorway. The older man looked at what Dreveth was doing. He looked at the portable storage device. He looked at the stack of records being copied. He said nothing. He came into the room and sat in his chair and opened the record he had apparently been in the middle of when he decided to return to the archive. And he read it with the specific stillness of a man who was not watching what was happening at the next desk. Dreveth finished the copies. He packaged the storage device in his kit. He sat for a moment. Outside, the Zeost night was doing what Zeost nights did. The deep purple sky, the faint stars, the distant lights of the fleet assembly in the upper orbital lanes that had been visible for 2 weeks now and would be gone by morning. The stone in this corridor, he said. Sevrath looked up. The cutting marks. I looked at them once. You can still see the tool pattern in the lower courses where the finishing work didn't reach. Pre-exile construction technique. Whoever cut these stones was working in a tradition that predated the founding of this empire. Sevrath studied the wall for a moment. Workers from the indigenous civilization, he said. Before the exiles arrived and the political order changed, several of the foundational archive structures were built with labor from that period. The cutting technique is distinctive wider blade angle, shallower bite. They were working with different tools for a different purpose. They couldn't have known, Dreveth said, what they were building toward, that it would still be standing 4,000 years later, that people would be sitting inside it. No, Sevrath said, they couldn't have known. A silence. Do you think they meant to build something permanent? Dreveth asked. Sevrath considered this. I think they meant to build something that would hold, he said finally. Permanence is what happens when something that was meant to hold continues holding past the point anyone expected. He looked at the wall for another moment. Most things that last were not built to last. They were built to be useful. The lasting was incidental. Dreveth thought about this. He thought about the archive records on the portable device in his kit. Whether they would be useful, whether useful and lasting were the same thing or different things in different orders. He did not reach a conclusion. Sevrath walked him to the archive entrance in the morning. The red light was just beginning the first thin edge of it above the upper city. the specific quality that Dreveth had been seeing every morning since he was old enough to understand what morning was. Sevrath walked slowly, as he always walked. They reached the entrance. The door was the original old wood, reinforced with metal fittings, the same door that had been here since the building was built. They stood there. They were not, as established, people who embraced. Sevrath said, "Read what you find there," Dreveth said. "There will be nothing to read there." They were both right. Sevrath meant, pay attention to everything. Record what you see. Come back with something true. Dreveth meant, the Republic is not what we are. Whatever we find will not be a civilization we need to study. It will be an obstacle to move through. He believed this when he said it. By the time he understood he was wrong, the fleet was already inside Republic space and there was no direction available except forward. The transport vessel lifted through the Ziost atmosphere an hour after first light. Dreveth stood at a viewport and watched the ground fall away. The city shrank. The Archive district became a cluster of dark stone rooftops. The upper city became geometry. Then the atmosphere thinned, and the geometry became a surface, and the surface became a sphere, and the sphere became the planet, and the planet was smaller than he expected it to look. From this distance, which was something every person who left a place for the first time discovered, and which did not become less true with knowing it was coming. The red sun was on the hull. The same light that had come through the archive windows every morning of his life here, now, on the metal surface of a military transport vessel, lighting the hull, the same color it lit the old stone. Warm-looking, not warm. The appearance of warmth that certain kinds of light create without producing the thing they suggest. He looked at it. He was aware of the distance between where he was and where he was going. The Republic, space he had read about and never seen. Civilizations he knew from records, and from the quality of silence in survey data that other people had generated and he had catalogued. He was aware of the distance between who he was now and who he would be when he came back. If he came back, he did not examine this thought. He filed it. He let it settle below the level of processing. In his kit, the portable storage device held the detailed records of 3 failed campaigns. He had the honesty of every mistake the Sith Empire had made in the last 2,000 years, compressed into a format he could carry in one hand. He did not know yet that honest knowledge, carried by one person, is almost never enough to change the outcome of a war that was started with a lie. He would learn this. He would learn it slowly, in the specific way that people learn the things they most needed to know before it was too late to use them. The war arrived before anyone had a word for it. That is not a poetic statement. It is a practical one. The Republic Senate did not formally designate the conflict until 11 days after the first strikes. In those 11 days, the people on the ground did not have official language for what was happening to them. They had smoke. They had the sound of ships that were not Republic ships moving through atmosphere at altitudes that civilian vessels did not use. They had the specific silence that falls over a city district in the minutes after something large and irreversible has happened, before the assessment begins, before the voices start, in the gap between the event and the understanding of the event. They had that gap for 11 days before anyone in a Senate chamber gave it a name. The people inside it did not need a name. They knew what it was. Jory had been back in Republic space for 3 weeks when the strikes began. She had spent those 3 weeks in debriefings. Not one debriefing, a series of them, conducted by different people in different rooms, with different levels of authority and different qualities of attention. Republic intelligence first, then a Senate Security Committee. Then 2 Jedi, not the famous ones, not the names that would appear in later accounts of the war, but working Jedi, the kind assigned to threat assessment rather than combat. They had listened to her account with the specific, patient attention of people trained to find the things a witness does not know they are telling. She told them everything she could tell them. The installation, the scale of it, the ships she had seen, hull classes, approximate counts, the formation patterns she had observed from the holding facility's transparent walls, the language, the guards, the quality of the construction, which suggested deep resources and long habitation. Naga Sadow, his fluency in basic, his knowledge of Republic navigation records, the specific character of his questions about her roots. She told them about Gav. She told them he was still there. The Jedi had asked her to describe Gav's state of mind during the one visit she had been permitted. She described it as carefully as she could, the new precision in his words, the way he was holding something. One of the Jedi had asked, without inflection, "Did he seem to be under duress?" She had thought about this. She had said, "No, that's the problem." They had noted this. They had moved to the next question. When the strikes began, she was in a Republic intelligence facility on Coruscant's upper levels. She heard about the outer district hits before she saw them. A staffer coming through a door with the specific body language of someone carrying information that has changed the meaning of the room they are walking into. The Empress Theta system, the outer approaches of Coruscant itself. Multiple simultaneous strikes, coordinated, which meant a fleet that had been in position before any Republic sensor had identified it. She understood, in that moment, what the beacon had been. She understood it completely and immediately, and with the specific clarity that comes when a thing you have been not quite thinking becomes unavoidable. She had led them here, not chosen to, been used to. She held both of those things at the same time and found, as she would continue to find, that holding both did not resolve into one. Being manipulated did not mean the outcome was not her fault. Her fault did not mean she had chosen it. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. And that was the shape of it, the shape she would carry for the rest of her life, not as drama, not as visible wound, but as the specific gravity of a knowledge that never became lighter no matter how long she held it. She walked through the outer district 3 days after the first strike, not on assignment, not as part of any official assessment. She had told the intelligence staffer she needed air and walked out of the facility and kept walking until the upper city became the mid-levels and the mid-levels became the outer district where the strike had landed. The smell reached her before the damage was visible. Burnt composite, something underneath it that was organic and was not food. Dust that was not ordinary dust, the specific particulate of destroyed building material, which settles differently than other kinds of dust, which coats surfaces with a gray film that takes weeks to fully clear. The buildings nearest the impact point were structural losses. Not collapsed entirely, the construction in this district was old and dense, and built with the kind of over-engineering that came from a civilization that had been adding layers to its city for 20,000 years. Things that should have fallen were still standing, held by the weight of what was around them. But the walls had moved, seams had opened, load-bearing elements had shifted in ways that looked stable and were not. People were moving through the streets, not fleeing. The fleeing had happened during and immediately after. These were the people who had come back, or who had never left. Doing the assessment, going through what remained of their spaces, sorting with the automatic efficiency of people who have entered a mode that has nothing to do with emotion yet, and everything to do with survival arithmetic. She walked without destination. She passed a family removing items from a ground-floor space whose facade had partially collapsed. A man passing water containers to two children who carried them without being asked. A Republic Emergency Services team marking structural damage codes on doorframes, a number and a letter. A system she did not know but could read by outcome. Green letter meant enter, yellow meant caution, red meant do not. There were more red marks than she wanted to count. She did not count them. She walked. She found the fountain by following the sound. She did not know she was following a sound until she was close enough to hear it clearly. The specific quality of moving water in stone, distinguishable from the other sounds of the district by its continuity. Everything else was intermittent. Voices, movement, the settling sound of damaged structures adjusting to new load distributions. The water was continuous. The lower district plaza. The buildings on the north side had taken damage. The facade of the nearest one had shed its outer layer of facing stone, exposing the structural courses beneath. The vendor stalls that normally occupied the plaza's eastern edge were destroyed. One of them was still partially standing, the frame intact, the surface materials gone, the specific skeleton of a thing that had been a place and was now an outline. The fountain was running. She stood and looked at it. She did not know why she stopped. There was nothing strategically significant about a fountain. There was nothing about it that addressed anything she was carrying. It was simply water moving through old stone in the same direction it had always moved, fed by something underground that the strike had not reached, producing the same quiet sound it had always produced in the same quiet way. The basin was gray with the settled dust. The water was clearing it slowly, the continuous flow pushing the film toward the overflow channel, a fraction of a centimeter at a time, patient in the way that only things without intention can be patient. She stood there for a while. She did not feel better. She did not feel worse. She felt the specific, unresolved weight of someone who has understood something that cannot be ununderstood, standing next to something that does not know what has happened and is continuing regardless. Then she walked back. On a transport vessel reassigned to ground support above the Empress Teta system, Drevith was learning what a Republic city looked like from the inside. He had read descriptions, he had processed survey records and administrative reports, and the second-hand accounts of Sith intelligence operatives who had operated in Republic space in previous decades. He had a comprehensive textual understanding of what Republic civilization looked like. The textual understanding was not the same thing as the city. The city was larger than the records suggested. Not in measurements, the records were accurate on dimensions, in density, in the specific compression of activity that came from a population that had been building on the same ground for generations, adding layers, each layer assuming the ones below it, and adding its own logic on top. The streets did not follow a grid. They followed the accumulated decisions of 10,000 years of people who needed to get from one place to another and found the shortest current path without concern for what the path would look like from above. He was not a commander. He had no strategic picture. He knew the piece he was standing in a supply coordination role, managing the distribution of equipment and materials to the forward positions that the initial strike forces had established. It was archive work, essentially, applied to a different kind of inventory. He was good at it. He was thorough and accurate, and he tracked the gaps in the supply chain with the same methodical attention he had applied to the fleet report discrepancies months earlier. The gaps were already appearing. He noted them. He filed them. He did not discuss them outside the appropriate channels. He did his job. On the third day of ground operations, he was on a landing platform at the edge of a held district. The platform faced west toward the uninhabited outskirts of the city, the industrial margins where the density thinned and the construction became functional rather than layered, where the horizon was actually visible instead of blocked by accumulated architecture. He stood at the edge of the platform. The view from there was open in a way that nothing in Zeost's city center ever was. The distance was real. It receded past the edge of the held zone, past the Republic positions they could see on the instruments, past the point where the fighting was currently happening, into space that was simply the world continuing without reference to the war being conducted on its surface. He looked at it. He was not thinking about strategy. He was thinking, and he did not know why he was thinking this, did not know what had triggered the association about the buffer zone, the space between Republic and Sith territory, the unmapped region that belonged to neither side and therefore provided cover for the kind of people who operated in gaps. The kind of people who had killed his parents on a supply run 12 years ago. Gaps between things. He had spent his career in the archive, filling gaps, noting the absent records, tracking the discrepancies, identifying the spaces where the official account did not match the detail record. He had understood gaps as administrative problems, as failures of documentation. He looked at the open distance beyond the platform. The view receded past the edge of what he could see, the same way the charts receded past the last coordinate, the same way any system of records eventually reached the point where it had to acknowledge, beyond this, we did not go. His parents had gone into a gap. They had not come back. He was standing, he understood, inside a different kind of gap. The space between what the Sith Empire had been and what Naga Sadow believed it could become. The space between the supply projections and the actual supply chain. The space between the war that had been planned and the war that was happening. Gaps were where people fell. He had known this since he was 19. He had not fully understood until now that he was standing in one. He went back inside. He returned to the supply manifests. He noted the discrepancies. He filed them accurately. He did not discuss them outside the appropriate channels. The second strike on the Teton district happened at the evening watch. Drevith was not in the district when it hit. He was on the transport vessel, 3 kilometers up, watching the thermal signature bloom on the instruments, and then listening to the silence on the communication channels that followed the specific silence of operators who have seen something and are processing whether what they saw is what they think they saw before they say anything on a recorded channel. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the channels filled. Below, in the district, the silence lasted longer. The sound of the strike passed. The pressure wave passed. The secondary sounds, structural collapse, the hiss of ruptured utility lines, the specific percussion of debris settling at different rates depending on mass, those passed too. And then there was the other silence, the one that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a new weight, the weight of a thing that had just become permanent. People emerged. They did the things people do in the immediate aftermath. Checked, called out, moved toward rather than away, the specific counter-instinctual movement of people looking for others who might need to be found. Nobody was crying. Crying was for later, when the body had permission to process what the mind had been managing. Right now, there was only assessment, only the sorting. One building was still burning, not catastrophically. The kind of burn that had settled into itself found its sustainable rate and would continue at that rate until it was interrupted or ran out of material. The fountain was running. It had been running before the strike, and it was running after it, and the water did not know the difference. The basin was gray again, the new dust settling on the surface. The water had spent 3 days, slowly clearing. The water began the work again, the same direction, the same rate. The underground spring continuing at the same pressure it had always maintained. Not hope, not consolation, just the fact of it. Some things continue, not because they deserve to, not because they are more important than the things that stopped, because they were built to reach the surface regardless of what was happening above them. The water moved. The dust cleared slowly. The building burned at its sustainable rate. The people sorted the recoverable from the unrecoverable. The war continued past this district, past this moment, past this specific weight that had just settled permanently into the ground of a city that had been building on the same foundation for 20,000 years and would, in some form, continue building. Nobody looked at the fountain. It ran anyway. There is a particular kind of silence in the historical record. Not the silence of things that were never witnessed, not the silence of things that happened in empty space with no one present to observe them. This is a different kind. The silence of things that were witnessed, that were known, that existed inside the memory of enough people that their absence from the official record is itself a shape, an outline you can trace by looking at what surrounds it. This chapter is about that shape. The Empress Theta system fell in stages. The first stage was the strike fast, coordinated, the kind of opening that is designed to produce shock before the target has time to produce a response. It worked. The Republic forces in the system were not prepared for the scale or the simultaneity of it. They had not been prepared because they had not known this was coming, and they had not known because the civilization sending the fleet had not existed in their intelligence assessments 48 hours earlier. The second stage was occupation. Sith ground forces moved into the civilian centers that the orbital strikes had cleared of organized resistance. They established positions. They secured supply routes. They did the things that occupying forces do not, because there was a specific plan for administration of captured Republic territory, but because the soldiers on the ground were doing what soldiers do when they have taken a position. They held it, and they waited for orders. The orders took 11 days to fully arrive. In those 11 days, the Republic counterattack did not reach the occupied centers. This was not a strategic decision on the Republic's part. It was a failure, specifically, a failure of fleet coordination caused by a communication error between two senior commanders who each believed the other was leading the relief column, and who each waited for the other to move, and who each reported to the Senate that the situation was developing as planned. The Senate believed them because the Senate was processing 17 simultaneous crisis reports from across the system and did not have the capacity to verify every field assessment in real time. The relief column was 11 days late. The civilian population centers were occupied for 11 days. What happened in those 11 days is not in the Republic's official war record. The surviving Sith records from the occupation period are incomplete. This requires a specific kind of explanation, because Sith records from this era are generally well preserved. The archive system was thorough, the cataloging was consistent, and the Empire maintained documentation practices that outlasted the civilization that produced them. The incompleteness of the occupation records is therefore unusual. Some of it can be explained by the end of the war. When the Republic drove the Sith forces back, some records were lost in the retreat, physically lost, storage units abandoned or destroyed, data that existed on systems that did not survive the withdrawal. This is documented. This accounts for a portion of the gaps. it does not account for all of them. The specific records that are missing: the daily logs from the ground commanders in the occupied centers, the supply and personnel records from days 4 through 9 of the 11-day period, the communication transcripts between the occupation leadership and the fleet command. These are missing in a way that is different from the records lost in the retreat. Those records are absent from the archive system entirely, not damaged, not corrupted, absent, as if they were not filed, as if the people responsible for filing them had decided during those specific days not to file them. Ground commanders in a military operation do not stop filing daily logs, not without a reason. The reason is not in any surviving record. The civilian accounts exist in fragments. They were not collected systematically. The Republic, when it retook the occupied centers, did not conduct a formal survivor testimony process. What exists comes from secondary sources, personal correspondence that was preserved by recipients outside the system, accounts included in later historical works that cited sources now themselves lost, fragments collected by a Jedi scholar 2 decades after the war, who interviewed elderly survivors and published a partial account that was not widely distributed and is now held in a restricted section of the Jedi archives. The accounts do not agree on specifics. Memory, under extreme duress, is not a consistent instrument. The accounts disagree on sequence, on numbers, on the identity of specific individuals involved in specific events. This is expected. This is how human memory works when it is asked to hold something larger than it was designed to hold. They agree on certain things. They agree that the civilian populations were not simply held in place and left alone. They agree that there were deaths during the 11-day period that were not caused by the initial strike deaths that occurred after the strike, after the occupation was established, after the period of initial combat had ended. They agree that the nature of some of those deaths was not consistent with the deaths that occur when a military force is suppressing active resistance. They agree on the silence. Several accounts describe the same phenomenon independently. A period of days. The accounts disagree on exactly which days, but cluster around days 5 through 8, during which a specific kind of silence descended over the occupied centers, not the silence of absence, the silence of people who have understood that certain sounds are dangerous to make, the silence of a population that has performed the rapid, collective assessment that occupied populations perform and has reached a collective conclusion about what behavior the current situation requires for survival. The accounts use different words for it. They describe the same silence. When the Republic relief column finally reached the occupied centers on the 11th day, there was a period of several days during which no official communications were sent from those locations to the Senate. This was unusual. The retaking of civilian population centers from enemy occupation was, in standard Republic military protocol, one of the highest priority communication events in any campaign. Senators whose constituent worlds were affected expected immediate status reports. The Senate Communications Office expected immediate status reports. The protocol existed specifically because the Senate had learned, in previous conflicts, that the absence of communication from retaken civilian centers produced rumors that were, without exception, worse than the truth. The silence lasted 4 days. No status reports, no casualty estimates, no public statements from the commanding officers of the relief column. The Senate Communications Office sent 3 requests for update during those 4 days. The responses it received were variants of the same phrase. Assessment ongoing. Full report to follow. The full report followed on the 5th day. It described the situation in the occupied centers as stabilized. It described Republic forces as having restored order and begun humanitarian assistance operations. It used the word stabilized 4 times in a document of moderate length, which is more times than that word typically appears in a military after-action report. It did not provide casualty figures for the occupation period. The figures were never published. A researcher working in the Senate archives 60 years after the war would note the absence of the casualty figures in a footnote to a broader study of the Great Hyperspace War's administrative record. The footnote cited the absence, noted that requests to the relevant military command for the original assessment documents had not been fulfilled, and characterized the gap as an area requiring further research. No further research was published. The footnote exists in a document that is available in the public section of the Senate archives. It has been accessed, according to the access logs, 11 times in the 60 years since it was filed. 7 of those accesses were by the researcher's own students. 3 were by an archivist conducting a routine collection audit. 1 was by a person whose access record lists their affiliation as independent scholar, and whose name does not appear in any other document in the archive system. The footnote does not explain what happened. It notes that something is absent. That is all it can do. Jory Daragon was in the Republic Intelligence Facility on Coruscant during the 11 days. Not in the Empress Teta system, not in the occupied centers. She was 3 hyperspace jumps away, in a debriefing room, answering questions about Naga Sadow's study and the fleet formations she had observed from the holding facility, and the quality of Gav's expression during his visit. She did not know what was happening in the occupied centers during those 11 days. She would not know, not fully, not in the way of specific knowledge for years afterward. What she would eventually know was the shape of the absence, the outline, the footnote that someone filed 60 years later, the restricted Jedi scholar's account that she would read once in a copy obtained through a contact she did not name to anyone and would not read again. She was adjacent. She was not present. She was not responsible. She carried the weight of adjacency for the rest of her life, which is a different weight from responsibility but is not a light one. Drevith was on the transport vessel above the system during the 11 days. He was processing supply manifests. He knew that ground operations were ongoing. He did not know the details of what ground operations entailed in the occupied centers. His access level did not include the ground command logs. The daily logs that should have been filed were not filed, and their absence did not register in his manifest system, because manifest systems track what is sent through them, not what should have been sent but was not. He was adjacent. He was not present. He would not know the shape of the absence until much later, until he was back in Ziost, in the archive, writing the accounts of survivors who would speak to him. Some of them would not speak to him about the 11 days. Some would begin to speak and stop. One would speak fully and then ask him, at the end, not to record what she had said. He recorded it. He filed it in a section of his personal archive that he did not cross-reference with the official record. He was an archivist. He could not make himself not record something true. He also could not make himself expose someone who had trusted him with it. These 2 things did not resolve. He held both of them. What happened next was never recorded by either side. 3 accounts exist from the occupation period that have not been collected into any official repository. They agree on nothing except the silence that followed, the specific silence, the one that descended over the centers during the Middle Days, the one that the survivors described years later in different words that meant the same thing. The Senate did not ask what caused the silence. The Sith Empire, in the records it did preserve, did not mention the silence. The silence was not a conspiracy. It was not coordinated. It was not the product of a decision made in a room by people with a plan to conceal. It was what silence usually is, the natural result of enough people independently concluding that certain things should not be said in certain contexts, arriving at the same conclusion without coordination, producing through accumulated individual choices a collective absence that looks, from the outside, like a decision. It was not a decision. It was a silence. It formed the way silences form, not chosen, just present. The war continued past it. The war ended. The record keepers on both sides chose what to preserve. They chose. The fountain in the lower district of Sinagar ran through all 11 days. The committee chamber on Coruscant's Senate level smelled of wood polish and recycled air, and the specific institutional cleanliness of a room that is cleaned thoroughly and regularly and has never, in its entire history of use, been comfortable. Jory had been in the room twice before. The first time was 8 days after her return to Republic space. The initial debriefing, informal by Senate standards, which meant only 6 people present instead of the full committee. The second time was 3 weeks later, when the strikes had begun and the Senate needed the account again in a form that could be entered into the official record and used to establish the sequence of events for whatever came next. This was the third time. The committee was larger now. 12 senators, plus aides, plus 2 Jedi observers seated to the left of the main table, whose presence was described as advisory, and whose eyes, when they were on her, had the quality of instruments taking readings rather than people listening. She sat down. She told the story. She had told it enough times that she knew its shape now, not just the content, but the architecture of it, the places where attention gathered and the places where it moved past. She knew which details the listeners needed to reach their own conclusions, and which details they preferred to leave in the undeveloped space between her sentences and their understanding. The beacon, the manipulation, Naga Sadow's study and his careful questions, and the specific quality of the kindness he had extended to a 23-year-old in captivity who was exhausted and afraid. She told it. She told it accurately. She watched them receive it. The senator from Koros Major spoke first when she finished. He was older, not the oldest in the room, but carrying his age with the particular gravity of a man who had learned to deploy it as a political instrument. He had the voice that certain kinds of public careers produce. Full, unhurried, calibrated for a room larger than the one he was currently in. He had given 3 public addresses in the past month that included her name. She knew this because the intelligence staffer who managed her schedule had told her, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone briefing a person on their own public existence. She had never met him before this session. He said, "Miss Darragon, the Republic owes you a debt that cannot be easily quantified." She said, "Thank you, Senator." He said, "Your courage in surviving your captivity and returning to warn the Republic." "I didn't know I was warning anyone," she said. "I didn't know about the beacon." A pause, brief. The kind that experienced politicians produce when a sentence has arrived that required a minor route adjustment. "Of course," he said. "Your return, regardless of the mechanism, provided the Republic with its first confirmed intelligence on the Sith Empire's location and military capacity. That intelligence has been invaluable in our response," he continued. She listened to him continue. He said several more true things in the way that makes true things serve purposes they did not originate from. Her name appeared 3 more times in the next 4 minutes of his speaking. Each time it appeared, it was attached to a word: courage, sacrifice, determination, that she had not used to describe herself, and would not use to describe herself, and that, once attached, would be difficult to remove without appearing to dispute a characterization that the speaker had made with evident sincerity. She watched this happen. She did not interrupt it. The session ran for 2 hours. The questions covered the same ground the previous sessions had covered, with variations that reflected the committee's current priorities, which had shifted, she could see, from understanding what had happened to constructing the most useful version of what had happened for the purposes of what came next. The useful version had certain features. It required Jory to have been a passive instrument taken, used, returned without her knowledge or consent. This was true. It required Naga Sadow to have acted with pure aggression, without provocation. As the initiating force of a conflict the Republic had done nothing to invite. This was partly true. It required the Daragon's presence in Sith space to be characterized as an accident with no contributing factors, navigational error, unforeseen circumstances, the kind of thing that could happen to any explorers pushing the boundary of mapped space. This was the part that was not entirely true. She had approved the override. She had built the route deliberately. She had been looking for something past the last coordinate, and she had found it. And the finding had consequences that no one could have predicted, but that her deliberate action had made possible in a way that pure accident would not have. No one asked her directly about the override. The question appeared in the record of the first session. She had answered it honestly and did not appear in the subsequent sessions. Its absence was not dramatic. It was simply absent, the way details absent themselves when they are not useful to the current purpose. She did not volunteer it. She told herself this was because no one asked. She knew it was also because she was tired, and the room was large, and the senator from Koros Major was looking at her with the specific expression of a man who had decided what she was and needed her to remain that thing for reasons that had nothing to do with her. After the session, he shook her hand. The handshake was warm, firm, the handshake of a man who had been shaking hands for 40 years and had developed a technique for it. The grip calibrated to convey sincerity. The duration calibrated to convey importance without crossing into the territory that would make her uncomfortable. She felt something attached to her during it, not physically, politically. The specific mechanism by which a person who has something useful to offer a narrative becomes part of that narrative permanently, not through their consent, not through any single decision anyone made, but through the accumulation of sessions and public addresses and handshakes until the narrative and the person are indistinguishable in the record, and the person is no longer being represented by the narrative, but is simply part of it. She walked out of the chamber. She did not say anything to anyone in the corridor. She thought about Gav. She thought about the senator's world, Koros Major, one of the Empress Theta system's primary industrial planets, manufacturer of mid-range military vessels for the Republic fleet. She thought about the fleet that was currently being expanded in response to the war. She thought about the expansion contracts that would have been assigned in the weeks since the strikes began, and where those contracts would have gone, and whose constituency would be manufacturing the ships that would fight the war that her return had helped the Republic understand was coming. She thought about the handshake. She did not reach a conclusion. She went back to the intelligence facility. She did not stop thinking. The transport vessel was retreating. Drevith did not use that word in the supply manifests he was processing because military logistics documents do not use that word. They use redeployment. They use tactical repositioning. They use withdrawal to secondary staging area. The language is specific, and the specificity is functional. It describes movement without assigning meaning to the movement, which allows the people conducting the movement to focus on the movement rather than on what the movement means. He used the correct language in the manifests. He knew what the movement meant. The battle at Primus Golud had been the turn. He did not know the full story of it. He did not know about the meditation sphere, the device Naga Sadow had been using to project phantom fleets across multiple battle theaters simultaneously. The device that had allowed one Dark Lord to appear as a dozen forces in a dozen places. The device whose failure had collapsed the illusion at the worst possible moment. He did not know the mechanism. He knew the result. He had been counting since the beginning ships, positions, supply allocations, the ratio of actual force to the strategic picture they were being told they occupied. The numbers had been wrong from early in the campaign. Not wrong in ways that were individually alarming. War involves fluctuation, involves positions held and lost and retaken, involves the normal mathematics of a large force operating across a large area. But the pattern of wrongness was specific. Certain positions had collapsed too fast. Certain fleet elements had disappeared from the communication net in ways that did not match standard combat attrition. Certain superiority claims made by command did not match the supply demands coming from the forces that command claimed were holding those positions. Forces that are holding a position draw supply. Forces that do not exist do not draw supply. He had been looking at the supply manifests for months. After Primus Golud, the pattern became legible. The forces that had disappeared from the communication net were not forces that had been destroyed in combat. They were forces that had never fully existed. Or rather, and this was the part he could not explain with the information he had, the part that would not become clear until years later when accounts of the meditation sphere began circulating. They had existed as projections, as things that appeared in sensor readings and tactical displays and the strategic assessments of Republic commanders, but that did not, in the physical sense, occupy the space they appeared to occupy. The Republic had not been fighting twice as large a force as they thought. They had been fighting an empire that was performing twice its actual size. The supply manifests had known. He had processed the supply manifests. He had not asked the right question until now. He sat with the manifests in front of him and asked the question. Not about the meditation sphere. He did not have enough information to ask that question yet. A different question, an earlier one. He pulled the records he had copied before deployment. The detailed files on the fleet, reports from the pre-war period, the ones he had processed in the Ziost archive in the weeks before the invasion. The ones with the supply allocations that didn't match routine exercises, the ones that had made him think of the third expansion campaign. He found the specific reports he was looking for, the ones that had documented Republic aggression. The intelligence assessments that Naga Sadow had presented to the Dark Council as justification for war, the evidence that the Republic was preparing to move against the Sith Empire, that the Daragons were scouts, that invasion was a defensive action taken before the Republic could act first. He had processed these reports. He had filed them. He had noted, in the margin of his personal copy, that the supply allocations in the adjacent fleet reports were inconsistent with the threat level the intelligence reports described. He had noted it and filed it, and not asked the next question. He asked it now. The intelligence reports described Republic military movements, specific movements, fleet positions, force concentrations, the build-up pattern that preceded an invasion. The reports were detailed. They had the specific texture of reliable intelligence, source citations, corroborating data points, the language of multiple independent confirmations arriving at the same conclusion. He looked at the corroborating data points. He had access to some of the underlying sources, not all of them, but the ones that had passed through the archive system where he worked. He cross-referenced. He found 3 instances where the underlying source said something different from what the intelligence report said it said. Not dramatically different. The kind of different that required careful reading to find the kind of difference that would not be visible to someone reading quickly. Reading to confirm a conclusion they had already reached. He found a 4th instance. Then a 5th. He sat for a long time. He was not a political analyst. He was not an intelligence officer. He was a supply archivist on a retreating transport vessel with a portable storage device full of historical precedents for what happened when Sith Dark Lords overextended into campaigns they could not sustain. But he was an archivist. He knew what it meant when the underlying sources did not match the report that cited them. It meant someone had written the report first and found the sources second. It meant the evidence for the war had been assembled to fit a conclusion that existed before the evidence did. It meant the Dark Council had been presented with proof of Republic aggression that was not proof of Republic aggression. It meant Ludo Kressh had been wrong about the Daragons being spies, but right in a way he could not have known, that the war was built on something false. It meant the soldiers who were dying in this campaign were dying in a war that their own Dark Lord had manufactured from evidence he had manufactured. He closed the files. He sat. Outside the viewport, the stars moved in the direction of home. In the Senate chamber and on the retreating transport vessel, separated by the width of a war, 2 people arrived at the same place from different directions. Not the same understanding. The specifics were different. The sources were different. The mechanisms by which they had each been used were different. But the place they arrived at was the same. The structure they had been standing inside the war's official account of itself, the reasons both sides had been given for what they were doing, was not built the way they had been told it was built. It was holding their weight. It would continue holding their weight for however long the war continued. That weight and the structure's willingness to bear it were no longer the same as trust. They had never been the same as trust. They had only appeared to be from the inside before the inconsistencies accumulated into a pattern that an honest person could not explain away. Jory sat in the intelligence facility and did not discuss what she was thinking. Drevith sat in the transport vessel and did not discuss what he was thinking. The manifests were filed. The session record was filed. The war continued. There is a moment in every war when the large decisions have already been made. The campaigns have been set. The fleets have their orders. The political machinery has determined what the outcome will be called and how it will be described, and which parts of it will be preserved for the record, and which parts will be allowed to settle into the silence that forms naturally around things no one wants to document. By the time that moment arrives, most of the people inside the war are no longer making decisions. They are executing consequences. But there is always a last moment, smaller than the large decisions, made without ceremony, made in private, where a specific person still has a choice, where the path has not yet fully closed, where what they do next is still in some meaningful sense, theirs. This chapter is about two people finding that moment. At the same time, in opposite directions. The Republic officer who came to see Jory was not senior. This was deliberate, she understood. Sending a senior officer would have given the request a formality that would have made it easier to refuse. A formal request could be formally declined. What they sent instead was a Lieutenant Young, professionally courteous, carrying a datapad with the relevant mission parameters and the specific body language of someone who has been told that the person they are visiting may be difficult and that difficulty should be absorbed without reaction. She was not difficult. She read the mission parameters. The pursuit fleet was being assembled. The objective was Naga Sadow's retreating forces, specifically his command position, which Republic intelligence believed was somewhere in the space between the Republic border and the Sith homeworlds. The route through that space was not on any Republic chart. The Republic had navigational data from the initial invasion, the path the Sith fleet had taken inbound. But the inbound path had been aggressive and direct, optimized for speed rather than concealment, and intelligence assessed that the retreat would not follow the same route. They needed someone who had been in that space, someone who had navigated it. Someone who understood the mass shadow patterns and the gravitational characteristics of the unmapped region well enough to project where a retreating fleet might go. There was one person in the Republic who qualified. The datapad had her name on it. She read to the end of the parameters. She set the datapad down. She thought about the Senate chamber, the senator's handshake, the specific mechanism by which a person becomes part of a narrative they did not write. She thought about the intelligence briefings where the senior officers had talked about the pursuit campaign with the language of conclusion, not if but when, not whether the retreating Sith forces would be found, but where. She thought about what Republic fleets did to things in their way. She thought about Gav. She did not know where he was. She knew he had sided with the Republic. This had come through intelligence channels 2 weeks ago. A field report describing a man matching Gav's description who had provided Republic forces with location data on Sith command positions. The report used the word defector and then crossed it out and used the word asset instead, which was the linguistic adjustment that intelligence made when someone's cooperation was useful enough to require careful categorization. He was somewhere in the space between the Republic border and the Sith homeworld. He was in the path of the pursuit fleet. Republic fleets did not, in the chaos of pursuit operations against a retreating enemy, conduct careful individual assessments of every person in their path before acting. They moved fast. They acted on the best available information. The best available information was incomplete by definition because the information was being gathered at the same speed the fleet was moving, and things in the way of a fleet moving that fast did not always survive the information gathering process. She needed to get to Gav before the fleet did what fleets did. That was the entire reason. Not the Republic. Not the Senate committees or the weapon manufacturer's handshake, or the clean version of her story that was being assembled for the archives by people who had decided what it meant before they had finished collecting what happened. Not any of that. Gao. One specific person in a specific location she did not know. In space. She had crossed once and could cross again if she had a ship and a pursuit fleet around her. And the navigational data she had spent 3 weeks building before any of this began. She picked up the datapad. She said, yes. The lieutenant noted it, professionally, without visible relief, which meant he had been told to expect difficulty and had prepared for it and was now recalibrating in real time. She handed the datapad back. She did not explain her reason. No senator would ever know what had motivated it. No archive record would contain it. It was the most honest thing she did in the entire war, and it was made entirely alone in a room with a junior officer who was already moving to the next item on his briefing list. The Sith retreat had a sound, not a battle sound. The battle sounds had changed, less coordinated, less the product of a unified command structure, and more the product of individual vessels and ground units, making local decisions in the absence of clear direction from above. The sound of a military force that has lost the central frequency it was tuned to and is now operating on harmonics, on muscle memory, on the residual momentum of an organization that was functional until very recently and has not yet fully processed that it is not functional anymore. Dreveth had heard this sound building for 3 weeks. He had heard it in the supply requests that stopped being answered on the standard timeline, in the communication protocols that started dropping steps, the confirmations that were supposed to come back from command and didn't, the routing instructions that arrived 12 hours late, and then 6 hours late, and then not at all. In the manifest discrepancies that were no longer discrepancies in the sense of errors requiring correction, but discrepancies in the sense of a system that was no longer consistently tracking its own components. An archive in disarray looked like this. A command structure in disarray looked like this. He had learned to read the first one. He could read the second. The orders that came through on the 43rd day of the retreat were ambiguous. Not ambiguous in the way of complex military language requiring careful interpretation. Ambiguous in the way of orders that had been drafted by a command structure that did not have clear answers to give and had sent the closest available approximation of an answer in the hope that approximation would be sufficient. Hold position. Await further clarification. Hold position. He read them twice. He pulled the communication log and looked at the routing path which command node the orders had come from, what its current operational status was, whether it had the authority and the information to issue binding orders to vessels in his transport's assignment category. The command node had last confirmed its own operational status 16 hours ago. 16 hours was a long time. He checked the secondary routing, the tertiary. The chain of command above his vessel's current assignment had, in the 43 days of retreat, been restructured 3 times. The current structure placed him under a command node that was, as best he could determine from the communication traffic he had access to, no longer in contact with the primary Sith command, which was, itself, no longer operating as a unified entity. Naga Sadow's command had fractured at Primus Galyud and had not reconstituted. What remained was multiple competing authorities, each issuing orders from their own position, none of them in full communication with the others. Ludo Kressh had returned to Sith space. This information had come through in fragmented form, not an official communication, but the kind of information that moves through a military force laterally, outside official channels, the way significant information always does when the official channels are unreliable. Kressh had come back to oppose Sadow. There was fighting in Sith home space. The Dark Lord who had opposed the war from the beginning had returned to end it, and the ending was going to require removing the Dark Lord who had started it. And neither of these events had anything to do with the transport vessel Dreveth was on, or the people on it. Hold position. Await further clarification. Hold position. He looked at the orders. He thought about what hold position meant in practical terms. It meant staying in the current location, which was contested space, which was space that the Republic pursuit fleet was entering from one direction and from which the remaining Sith forces were evacuating in whatever direction was available. Holding position in contested space that both sides were moving through was not a military posture. It was a target. He thought about the archive buildings on Ziost, the red light through the stone windows in the morning, the smell of the cataloging fluid, the specific quiet of the early shift before the rest of the staff arrived. Sevrath's desk already occupied when everyone else arrived, the older man reading with the stillness of someone who had stopped being in a hurry several decades ago. He thought about the portable storage device in his kit, the records he had copied, the accounts he intended to write, the work that required him to be alive and on Ziost to do it. Hold position was an order issued by a command structure that no longer fully existed, instructing him to remain in a location that would get his people killed. On behalf of a war that had been started with manufactured evidence and was ending in a power struggle between two Sith Lords who were fighting each other while the Republic fleet moved through the space his vessel was currently occupying. He made the decision. He did not dramatize it. He did not announce it. He went to the navigation station and he began entering the course correction, a route toward the Sith homeworlds, toward Ziost, the most direct path that avoided the primary Republic fleet vectors and the primary Sith retreat corridors, and kept to the margins where the traffic from both sides was thinnest. It was not desertion. He told himself this because it was true. He was not abandoning a functional command structure. He was navigating the absence of one. He was making the decision that every soldier in a collapsing structure eventually has to make. Not which side am I on, but what does my duty actually require when the side I am on is no longer capable of telling me. His duty, as he understood it, was to the people on his vessel. His duty, as he understood it, was to the records in his kit. His duty, as he understood it, was to get back to Ziost and write down what he had seen with the same honesty he had brought to every cross-reference, every amended entry, every discrepancy noted and filed, without discussion outside the appropriate room. He was right about all of this. He was also, in the most fundamental sense, done with this war. The two things were not in conflict. They were the same thing from different angles. Both vessels entered hyperspace within the same hour. This is not meaningful in the strategic sense. Thousands of vessels were entering hyperspace in that hour. The pursuit fleet, the Sith retreat, the supply ships and the medical transports, and the intelligence vessels, and the individual craft of people making individual decisions in the chaos of an ending war. Two specific vessels entering hyperspace within the same hour is not a coincidence that carries strategic weight, but it is a coincidence. And coincidences, in the records that survive, are worth noting. Jory felt hyperspace the way she always felt it, the wrongness of it, the specific discomfort of a transit designed for military speed rather than civilian comfort. The stars outside the viewport stretched into lines that did not look like stars anymore, but like the idea of stars, the abstraction of light movement that the transit corridor produced. She had crossed unmapped space once before. She was crossing it again. The nav computer was working from her projections, the route she was building in real time from the mass shadow data and the gravitational readings the sensors were collecting as they moved. She was doing what she had always done, reading the space ahead and finding the path through it by the intersection of calculation and the thing underneath calculation that her mother had called reading the space, and that Jory had never been able to name more precisely than that. She was thinking about Gav. She was thinking about the last time she had seen him, the careful new precision in his words, the way he was holding something she couldn't name yet. She was thinking about whether the person she was going to find at the end of this route was the same person she had left in Sith captivity, or whether the war had done to him what it did to people, had taken the person who went in and produced someone different on the other side, someone who carried the original person inside them, the way a scar carries the shape of what caused it. She did not know. She would find out. The transit corridor stretched around her. She navigated. Drevith felt hyperspace the way he had felt it the first time, the distance of it, the way it accumulated around the vessel, the sense of being between things rather than in a place, the specific quality of transit that the soldiers on the first deployment had described as leaving something behind, and that he had understood on the first crossing, was not metaphor, but physical sensation. He was going home. He did not know if home would be what he had left. He knew the archive buildings would be standing. He had enough faith in the old stone, in the cutting technique of workers from a civilization that predated the exile, to believe that the buildings would have held. The question was what they would hold now, what the war had changed in the space between the stone walls, what Sevrath's desk would look like without Sevrath at it, what the early morning archive would sound like in the specific quiet of a place that had lost the person who most fully inhabited it. He did not know the answer to these questions. He had the records in his kit. He had the accounts he had not yet written. He had the Archivist's discipline, the understanding that the work was to record what was true, regardless of whether what was true was what anyone wanted in the record. He would go back. He would write it down. The transit corridor stretched around him. He navigated toward the red sun. They were moving in opposite directions. The space between them was widening at the combined speed of two vessels in military hyperspace transit. They had never been closer. In the structural sense, both of them in the same quality of wrongness, the same stretched light, the same accumulated distance, the same feeling of having made the only decision available to them, and of that decision being, in its smallness and its privacy, the most fully theirs of anything the war had produced. Neither knew the other existed. The space between them widened. The stars, outside both viewports, were the same abstraction of light, the transit corridor's version of stars, which were not stars, but the memory of stars, held in the shape of lines, while the distance between two people who had never met and would never meet grew larger. With every second of a crossing, they were both making for the same reason, not for a side, for a specific thing, for a person, for a place, for the irreducible fact of one particular thing that the war had not yet taken, and that they were moving toward as fast as the ships around them would go. The distance widened. Wars do not end cleanly. They end in stages. A battle that is decisive without feeling decisive. A command that surrenders without the surrender reaching every position that was fighting under it. A silence that spreads unevenly across a theater of operations like weather, moving across uneven terrain, arriving at different times in different places, so that the war is over in one location while it is still fully happening in another. The official end has a date. The actual end is different for every person who was inside it. For some people, the war ended months before the official date, the moment they understood the outcome, the moment the numbers became legible, the moment the structure they had been standing inside showed them its actual shape, and they could not unsee it. For some people, the war did not end with the official date at all. It simply changed form. The Republic pursuit fleet found Naga Sadow's position on the 41st day after Jory entered hyperspace. She had been navigating for most of those 41 days, not continuously, not alone. but as the primary intelligence source for a route-building team that was working in real time from the sensor data the fleet was generating as it moved through unmapped space. She had done this work the way she did all navigation work, methodically, honestly, without inflation of confidence and without false uncertainty. When she knew something, she said so. When she was projecting from incomplete data, she said that too. The fleet commanders had found this useful and slightly frustrating in equal measure. Military commanders operating under time pressure preferred confidence. She gave them accuracy. The distinction mattered to her and annoyed them, and they used her projections anyway because the projections were correct more often than the alternatives. She had been tracking Gav's possible location through the same process. Not officially. There was no official mechanism for what she was doing. The fleet was not running a search and locate operation for one individual in the chaos of a pursuit campaign. She was doing it in the margins of the navigation work, using the same sensor data the fleet was collecting, building a parallel projection of where a person who had been in Sith command space and had been working with Republic intelligence field operatives might currently be relative to the fleet's position. The projection kept placing him close to Naga Sadow's command position. This made sense in a terrible way. Gav had been giving the Republic location data on Sith command positions. That data had to come from somewhere, from someone close enough to the command structure to have access. Close enough to the command to have access meant close enough to the command to be in the battle when the command was found. She had known this. She had been working faster because of it. The battle for Naga Sadow's command position lasted 11 hours. She was not in it. She was in the operations center of the Republic flagship, at a navigation station, doing the work that navigation does during a battle, tracking positions, projecting movement, providing the spatial intelligence that allowed the fleet commanders to understand where things were relative to other things in three-dimensional space that was moving constantly. She tracked everything. She tracked Gav's last confirmed position from the field operative communication that came through the intelligence channel at the 4th hour of the battle. She tracked the Sith loyalist movement that the battle maps showed converging on that position at the 7th hour. She tracked the gap between the Republic forces that should have reached that position and the Republic forces that actually reached it, and the time difference between should have and actually, and what that time difference meant for someone who had been at that position when the Sith loyalists arrived. She knew before anyone told her. The official notification came at the 9th hour, from an intelligence liaison who found her at the navigation station and spoke to her quietly, with the specific cadence of someone delivering information they have been asked to deliver as gently as possible. He said that Gav Daragon had been killed by a Sith loyalist at the 7th hour of the battle. He said that Gav's action, the location data he had provided, had been critical to the fleet finding Naga Sadow's position. He said that Gav's action had saved Republic lives. She said, "I know." The liaison waited for something else from her. She did not have something else. She turned back to the navigation station. She kept working. The battle ended at the 11th hour. The Republic won. Naga Sadow escaped this. Would not be confirmed for several hours. And in the operations center, the first phase of celebration began before anyone knew the Dark Lord himself had fled. The celebration was not loud. It was not the kind that produces noise and movement and the visible release of accumulated tension. It was the kind that produces a specific quality of exhale, the guarded, exhausted satisfaction of people who have been operating at the edge of their capacity for a sustained period and have arrived at a moment that is recognizable, finally, as an ending. People shook hands. People said things to each other that were true and that they had not been able to say while the outcome was still uncertain. Someone brought something to drink. The room, slowly, became a different kind of room. Jory stood at her station. She was present in the physical sense. She was at the correct location. Her hands were on the correct instruments. If someone had spoken to her, she would have responded with the correct words in the correct sequence. She was somewhere else entirely. Not in grief, not yet. Grief was for later, when the body had permission to process what the mind had been managing. Right now, there was only the specific, total quietness that had descended inside her at the 9th hour and had not lifted. A quietness that had nothing to do with the room. The room was filling with the beginning of victory. The quietness was not about the room. It was about Gav, specifically the last time she had seen him. In the Sith holding facility, through the transparent wall, the one permitted visit, the careful new precision in his words, the way he had been holding something she couldn't name then and couldn't name now, but could feel the shape of a person who has been shown things that changed what they understood and has not yet determined what to do with the change. He had made a determination. He had given the Republic what it needed. He was dead. The Republic had won. She understood that the first two things, and the third and the fourth, were all true simultaneously, and that none of them resolved any of the others. She would need to speak soon. Someone would come to her with something that required a response, a request, a formality, the beginning of the process by which the official narrative would be assembled from the events of the last 11 hours, the process in which her role would need to be described. And Gav's role would need to be described, and the description would be shaped by the people doing the shaping, as it always was. She would speak. She would say the right things. She would perform what was needed with the same accuracy she brought to navigation work, honest enough to be credible, contained enough to be useful, not more than what the moment required. But not yet. For this specific moment, while the room filled with the careful beginning of victory around her, she was somewhere else. She was in the common space of the Starbreaker 12, 2 chairs and a bolted table and a food heater that worked intermittently, and Gav was across from her doing the calculation she had asked him to do, and he was going to look up in a moment and say, "Okay," in the way that meant he had examined the work and was trusting the person who had done it. He was going to look up. She waited. The archive buildings on Zeost were standing. Drevith walked through the city from the docking point to the archive district, and he looked at them the way a person looks at something they were not certain they would see again, not with drama, but with the specific, quiet attention of confirmed presence. They were there. The old stone, the distinctive cutting marks in the lower courses, the long windows that faced the city, catching the red afternoon light the same way they always caught it, holding it in the stone for the hours after the sun moved on. He went inside. The early shift archive was empty. This was wrong in a specific way. The early shift was never fully empty. Even in the quiet hours, there was always someone, usually Sevrath, at the first desk inside the main corridor. The desk was there. The materials on it were organized in Sevrath's characteristic way, not neat in the conventional sense, but organized in the logic of a person who knew exactly where everything was and whose organizational system was incomprehensible to anyone else. The materials were there. The organization was there. Sevrath was not there. He had known this was possible. He had known it during the retreat, during the crossing, during the 41 days of the pursuit campaign that he had spent in the margins of the war's ending. He had carried the possibility the way he carried the records in his kit present. acknowledged, not examined, beyond what the carrying required. He sat down at his own desk. He sat for a moment. Then he opened his kit. He took out the portable storage device. He placed it on the desk beside the current supply of fresh tablets, the blank ones, the ones used for permanent record entries, the ones that the archive used for accounts that needed to be held in the most durable format available. He picked up the first tablet. He picked up the stylus. He began to write. He wrote what he had seen. Not the strategic picture. He did not have the strategic picture, had never had it, had only ever had the piece he was standing in. He wrote the piece he was standing in. The supply manifests and what they had told him, the fleet reports and the inconsistencies in the underlying sources, the 11 days of occupation and the silence that had formed around them, the silence he had observed from the transport vessel above the system, the way the communication channels had gone quiet in a specific pattern that he could describe accurately without being able to explain fully. He wrote Sevrath's desk, already occupied every morning. He wrote the third expansion campaign records and what they had suggested and what no one had acted on. He wrote the buffer zone, not his parents' death, not directly, not as a personal account. He wrote about the buffer zone as a structural phenomenon, the space between two civilizations that neither side claimed, that therefore had no governance, that therefore had no accountability for what happened inside it. He wrote about what happens in gaps. He wrote this carefully, with the archivist's discipline of not asserting more than the record supported. He did not write about his parents by name. Anyone reading carefully would understand. He learned about Sevrath within the week. Not combat. The war had not reached Zeost directly in the period of Dreveth's absence, and Sevrath had not been a soldier in any sense that would have put him in a combat position. He had become ill during the war's middle phase, an illness that in peacetime would have been treatable, that in wartime had not been treatable, because the medical resources of a civilization at war are distributed according to military priority, and an elderly archivist was not a military priority. He had continued working until he could not. The junior archivist who told Dreveth said that Sevrath had been in the archive the morning before he died, had organized the materials on his desk, had left a note in the amendment log, a formal entry, properly dated, properly formatted, that said, "Record amendment. Leave of absence begins today. Reason, medical. Return date, undetermined." He had not returned. Dreveth sat with this for a while. He did not go back to writing that day. He went to the window at the end of the corridor, the long window that faced the city, that he had stood at. On the afternoon he watched the fleet ships move in formation overhead and not said what he understood to Sevrath, because Sevrath had already said what needed to be said in the way old scholars said things, through recommendation of specific records, through the patience of waiting for the other person to notice. He stood at the window. Outside, the red sun was going down. The sky was deepening toward the purple that came between the sun's descent and the full dark, that specific Zeost color that was neither the red of day nor the black of night, but the interval between them, the color of a sky that is transitioning. He looked at it. He was not thinking about the war. He was thinking about what came next. He did not know what came next. He knew what the work was, the accounts to write, the records to compile, the careful, honest documentation of what he had seen and what he had cross-referenced and what the cross-referencing suggested. He knew the work would take a long time. He knew it would be incomplete, because all records are incomplete, because the events they describe are always larger than the records that hold them, because there is always a gap between what happened and what can be said to have happened in a form that survives. He knew the work anyway. That was enough. Jory stood at a viewport on the Republic flagship. The battle was over. The room behind her had completed its transition into something that resembled, from the outside, the aftermath of a victory. She had spoken to the people who needed her to speak. She had said the things that were true and useful, and said them with enough accuracy that they were received as intended. She was done, for now, with what the room required. She looked out. The space outside the viewport was unmapped. Not in the technical sense. The fleet had been generating navigational data throughout the campaign, and the region they were currently in would be added to the Republic charts in the processing that followed. But it still had the quality of unmapped space. The specific openness of it, the way it receded past the edge of what any chart had previously contained, past the last coordinate any Republic navigator had formally filed, into the distance that her parents had spent their lives moving toward, and that she had continued moving toward without fully deciding to. She looked at it. She was not thinking about the war. She was thinking about what came next. She did not know what came next. She knew she would keep moving. She knew the routes were still there to be found. The unmapped space was large, and the work of mapping it was long. And she was her parents' daughter, and the work did not stop because the people doing it sometimes did. She knew she would file the routes under the Daragon name, and she knew Gav's name would be in the filing, and she knew she would not visit the archives where it was recorded. She knew the space outside this viewport was the same space she had been looking at her whole life. The edge of the chart, the point where the record ended, and the actual territory continued without it. She kept looking. The distance did the thing distances do. It continued. The war ended on a date that was entered into the Republic archives with the specific precision that official records require. The date is accurate. What the date cannot hold is everything that continued past it. The people who carried the war inside them into the years that followed, who woke up in the mornings of peacetime with the weight of it still present, who went about the ordinary work of living with the specific knowledge that ordinary life had a before and an after, and that the line between them was permanent. The date marks a boundary. The boundary did not stop anything. It simply changed what things were called. Jory filed her first post-war route 8 months after the official end. It was a short one, a correction to an existing corridor in the mid-outer rim, a refinement of the mass shadow data that improved transit time by a small but meaningful margin, not a discovery. Not the kind of filing that generated attention. She submitted it to the Republic Cartographic Office under the Daragon name, and received a standard acknowledgement, and moved on to the next survey. She worked steadily. Not quickly, she had learned, in the years since the war, that quickly was not the point. Her parents had worked quickly, in the sense of urgency, always moving toward the next coordinate before the current one was fully documented. She understood now where that urgency came from and what it had cost them. She worked at the pace the work required. She documented fully before she moved on. She did not stop moving. The routes accumulated under the Daragon name, a growing body of work filed in the Cartographic Office's records, cross-referenced with the existing charts, slowly filling the edges of what the Republic knew about the space. Beyond its last official coordinates, each route was accurate. Each route was honest about what it found and what it didn't find, and where the data was strong and where it was projected from incomplete information. She noted the gaps. She did not fill them in when the data did not support filling them in. She marked them as gaps, the specific notation that meant surveyed to this point, beyond, not yet known. The not yet known is real. It is not our absence of knowledge. It is the actual shape of what remains. Her parents had found 3 corridors that became major commercial lanes. She found 7. She did not visit the archives where this was recorded. She did not correct the official story, the clean version, the one that ended with her return and Gav's sacrifice and the Republic's victory. The version that the senator from Koros Major had helped shape in the years after the war, and that had become, through repetition and official entry, the version that survived. She understood why it was the version that survived. She understood that the full version, the debt, the override, the manipulation, the beacon she had not known about, the 11 days she had been adjacent to, the handshake that had attached things to her she had not agreed to carry, required more complexity than official narratives were built to hold. She left it. She went back to work. The galaxy's edges became, slowly, less unknown because of her. This was not a monument. It was not a tribute. It was simply what the work produced when someone did it honestly for long enough. She was very good at her work. She had always been very good at her work. Drevith wrote slowly. This was not a limitation. It was the correct pace for the kind of writing he was doing, the kind that required verification, cross-reference, the careful attention to what the record could support and what it could not. He had learned this pace in the archive. He applied it to the accounts he was building. He found the survivors through patience. Most of them did not want to be found at first. The soldiers of the non-noble class, the ones who had served in the invasion fleet and the occupation forces and the retreat, the ones whose names would not appear in any official Sith historical record because the official Sith historical record was, in the aftermath of the war, primarily concerned with the actions of Dark Lords and the political consequences of their decisions. These people were not difficult to locate. They were living on Zeost and the other Sith homeworlds, doing the work of reconstruction, returning to the occupations the war had interrupted. They were not hiding. They were simply not speaking. The silence was not conspiracy. It was what silence usually was, the natural result of people who had been inside something large and had not yet determined what could be said about it, and to whom, and in what form. He waited. He made himself available. He asked specific questions, the Archivist's questions, the ones that came from someone who already knew the shape of the record and was looking for the details that filled it in. Slowly, people spoke. He wrote down what they said. He wrote down the supply routes that had failed, and when they had failed, and what the failure had meant for the people depending on them. He wrote down the occupation carefully, with the discipline of recording what the sources agreed on and noting explicitly where they disagreed, and not resolving the disagreement artificially. He wrote down the retreat, the ambiguous orders, the individual decisions made in the absence of clear command, the specific experience of being in a collapsing structure and having to determine from the inside what duty required. He did not include himself directly. Any careful reader would know he had been there. The questions were the questions of someone who had stood at a landing platform and looked at the open distance and thought about the gaps between things. The questions were the questions of someone who had cross-referenced the fleet reports and found the inconsistencies and sat with them for a long time before asking the next question. He was in the record the way a hand is in water, the shape of the presence visible in what surrounds it, not in the thing itself. The record he built was incomplete. He noted the incompleteness carefully in the formal amendment notation that the archive system required. Record incomplete. The following accounts could not be obtained. List. The following sources were destroyed or lost during the retreat. List. The following events have no surviving witnesses willing to provide testimony. List. The list of what was missing was almost as long as the list of what was present. He did not pretend otherwise. He filed it as it was honest in its gaps, accurate in what it held, a record that would not tell anyone everything, but would tell anyone who read it carefully enough exactly what it could and could not say. It was not enough. It was what was possible. He did it anyway. The Jedi felt the war for years after it ended. Not in the political sense. The political consequences of the Great Hyperspace War were immediate and visible and generated their own record in the Force. In the specific quality of the Force around the coordinates where the war's largest events had occurred. Several Jedi Masters described the same phenomenon independently, in separate writings over the decade that followed. They described it without a shared vocabulary, each of them reaching for different language to hold the same experience. What they agreed on, that the Force in those regions was not dark, not wounded in the way that the Force could be wounded by concentrated suffering or deliberate corruption. Something different. A resonance. The quality of a place that has been asked to hold something larger than it was built for, and has done so, and is still, slowly, working through the weight of it. Odan wrote about it once, in a text that was not formal scholarship but a personal reflection, written in the years after the war, when he was still young enough to be surprised by what the Force showed him, and old enough to write about it honestly. He wrote that the Force had a memory, not in the mystical sense, not the memory of vision or prophecy, in the physical sense, the way stone holds warmth after the sun has moved on, the way a room holds the quality of what happened in it long after the event has passed, and the people have left, and the surface has been cleaned. The war's stones held warmth. He could feel it at the coordinates where the battles had been largest. He could feel it at the edge of the Empress Teta system. He could feel it in the space between the Republic border and the Sith homeworlds, the unmapped region, the buffer zone, the gap between two civilizations that neither side had claimed, and that the war had moved through like weather. He wrote that he did not know what to do with this knowledge. He wrote that he was not sure knowing what to do with it was the point. The resonance would fade. He wrote that too. It did not fade quickly. 3 years after the war ended, Jory charted a route through the buffer zone. She had been building toward it for a year, accumulating the sensor data, cross-referencing the old survey fragments that existed in the cartographic office's deep archive. The ones from explorers who had approached the region from both sides before the war and turned back at the edge of it. She had enough data to project a route. She had enough experience to know that projecting a route through the buffer zone was not the same as running it, and that running it would generate information that projection could not. She ran it. The buffer zone was quieter than she expected. Not in the sensor sense. The sensors were active, and the data was dense. The region filled with the navigational complexity of space that had absorbed decades of transit without ever being formally mapped. Debris from old routes, navigation markers of designs. She did not recognize some of them. Sith, she determined, from the material and the frequency placed by ships that had moved through this space in the years before the war, when the Sith Empire was still unknown to the Republic. Some of them Republic, from the explorers who had pushed this far and left markers that meant we were here in the formal notation that meant nothing to anyone who did not know the notation system. She found her parents' last marker. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had been mapping the existing markers systematically, logging each one with its coordinates and its design signature, and its estimated age. The marker was old, consistent with the period of her parents' last run, placed at the edge of the region where their confirmed position ended and the record of them stopped. They had been here. They had placed a marker. They had continued past it. She held the coordinates of the marker in the navigation system for a long time. She thought about Dreveth's parents, not about Dreveth, who she did not know existed, whose name was not in any record she had access to. She thought about the supply convoy that the intelligence reports had mentioned, the one that had been ambushed in the buffer zone in the years before the war. She thought about the people who had died in the gap between two civilizations that neither side claimed. She thought about the gaps. She marked the marker's coordinates in her survey log. She noted its design signature. She noted its age estimate. She noted that it was consistent with the period of the Daragon exploratory team's last confirmed position. She wrote, in the notes field, significance, personal, nature of significance, not included in this record. She moved on. She continued mapping. She found the gaps, the places where the space had absorbed something that had not been recorded by either side, where the sensor data had a specific quality that she had learned to recognize, not from instruments, from the thing underneath instruments, the thing her mother had called reading the space. She marked the gaps as gaps. She did not fill them in. Some things should remain known as gaps. The record that marked them was more honest than a record that pretended they were not there. In Sinagar's lower district, the market opened at the same hour it always did. The buildings around the fountain were not the same buildings that had stood there before the war. The ones that had taken damage during the Sith strikes had been demolished and rebuilt, not in the original style, which no longer existed as a living architectural tradition in this district, but in the style that the Reconstruction period produced, which was its own style, the style of people who needed to build quickly and practically, and who brought to the building the specific aesthetic of people who had recently learned what structures were for. The new buildings were not ugly. They were honest in the way that things built from necessity are honest without pretension, without the specific ornamentation that comes from a civilization that has enough security to decorate things that don't require decoration. They stood around the fountain. The fountain was older than any of them. The child came through the market with her mother on an ordinary morning. She was young enough that the market was still interesting as a total sensory environment. The sounds and the smells and the specific compression of people and goods in a space designed for their intersection. She was old enough to ask questions about what she saw rather than simply absorbing it. She saw the fountain. She stopped. She asked her mother, "Did someone build it, or has it always been there?" Her mother looked at the fountain. She said, "I don't know." This was the honest answer. The mother had grown up in a different district of Sinagar, had moved to the lower district after the Reconstruction, in the years when the rebuilt areas were affordable. In a way, the undamaged areas were not. She had not grown up with the fountain. She knew it had been there before the war, because the older residents of the district spoke of it in the way that people speak of things that were present before the event, that divides their memory into before and after. But she did not know who had built it, or when, or what the builders had intended it to be. She said, "I don't know." The child reached out and touched the water. It was cold. Not the cold of something recently chilled, the cold of something that had been coming up from deep underground for a very long time, fed by a spring that the city above it had never reached, that the strikes had not reached, that the Reconstruction had not changed, and that the passage of time had not changed, because the passage of time does not change underground springs. The water moved past the child's hand. It moved as it had always moved, the same direction, the same rate, the same cold. The market sounds continued around it. The vendors and the buyers, and the ordinary language of a city going about its morning. The child kept her hand in the water for a moment. Then she took it out. She and her mother moved on into the market. The fountain ran. This is what the war left. Not the official record that exists, and will continue to exist, and will be read by people who need it to tell them what happened, and who happened, and when, and with what consequence. The official record is real. It is not complete. No record is complete. What the war left, beyond the record, was the specific weight that certain coordinates in space now carried. The resonance that the Jedi felt and wrote about and could not fully explain. The gaps in the Sith archive that were shaped like 11 days. The footnote that someone filed 60 years later about casualty figures that were never published. What the war left was Jory Daragon, moving steadily through the edges of the Republic's charts, filing roots under her family's name, noting the gaps honestly and leaving them as gaps. What the war left was Drevith of Zeost, at his desk in the archive, writing down accounts in the careful notation of someone who knows that the record will outlast the people who made it and who takes that knowledge seriously. What the war left was the fountain, running, cold, fed by something so deep underground that nothing that had happened at the surface had ever reached it. The child's hand had been in the water. The water had moved past it. The water was still moving. The war is in the record now. The record will outlast the people who made it. That is what records are, for not to explain, but to hold. To say, this happened, these people existed, this is what it cost. The fountain runs.